Beam weapons have been a staple in the Gundam franchise since 1979, and throughout the years, we as viewers have been introduced to dozens upon dozens of defenses created to counter them. In this video, I'll take you through a 46-year journey as we dive into the various forms of beam defenses found throughout the multiple Gundam series and movies. Before we start, I'm going to mention some quick rules to set the stage. First, this will go in chronological order, not production order, mainly only applicable throughout the Universal Sentry portion of the video, since it wouldn't make sense for me to talk about how advanced the Wings of Light are in the Victory era of UC, and then later go back 57 years to talk about how Unicorn's tech is older, despite coming out later in production order. That's just lmao. Second, this video will cover animated works only. No side stories, manga, novel, or game appearances, since an overwhelming majority of the thousands of MSV suits have straight up zero animated footage to them, and including them in a video meant to showcase clips of beams being defended against is just lmao. Oh yeah, I'm also not counting SC series either, cause well, you guessed it, lmao. Okay, and finally, all of the info in this video come from either the wiki, official sources like Gundam Info, MS Bibles and Gunpla manuals, or from personal knowledge from myself, since I've watched literally every Gundam series that's ever come out, including OVAs, ONAs, specials, G-Savior, and yes, this one too. And even this one. And also even this one. That's not even out fully on digital at the time of recording. That being said, the format will go like this. I'll show a few on-screen instances of each unique beam defense, and then give technical notes, along with an analysis of pros and cons for each entry. Circling back to clips, it took me a 3-digit amount of time to find hundreds of super specific clips throughout the different series, many that have 50 episodes, mind you. So I hope you enjoyed a byproduct of the torture I put myself through for this video. Alright, all good? Grab your dinner, lunch, or pillow, and let's get right into it with the UC portion of the video. Also, I'm gonna be sitting in front of the screen to prevent copyright. Ready?
Go! My left ball hearts.
Starting off the list, we have a very recent entry with the two modified Zaku 2 F-types, developed at the recycling center after being damaged by the Gundam EX. The Zaku's wire-guided pellet shots don't actually have any official sources regarding how or why it disrupted the Jim's beam spray gun. However, this was something we haven't seen in Gundam thus far, and for that, it's on the list. Please trust me, the rest of the video will have a lot more in-depth analyses, so just bear with me on this one. This specific entry is just really underdeveloped. As for pros and cons, due to this form of beam defense being reliant on a finite amount of ammunition, naturally it results in limited protection against beams. Though, these missiles are clearly designed for close and mid-range ground encounters, as opposed to some of the upcoming entries that could only be used in space. The iconic upgrade of the Groove from Mobile Suit Gundam, piloted to perfection by Norris Packard, the Groove Custom possessed a staple of beam defense in the form of beam-resistant coating, which was applied to the cockpit region. I should note that I'll be referring to any similar beam coating defense under the umbrella term of ABC, or anti-beam coating moving forward, which includes beam-resistant coating and the like, just for simplicity and to cut down on redundancy. In later works and other timelines, ABC would find its way being applied to a ton of physical shields moving forward, and I won't be covering each and every instance of this, or else this video will be 4 hours long. Though, you can bet on me covering unique cases like the Hyakushiki later when we get to Zeta. How it works is that the coating allows slight damage mitigation from beams and lasers by absorbing energy from megaparticles. And ultimately, this coating allowed the Goof Custom to withstand the EZ8's beam saber for just long enough to take down the last gun tank before getting bisected. As just mentioned, a major weakness of the coating is that it can only withstand beam weapons to a limited degree, and could be easily overpowered and bypassed by a close range fire or high enough beam output. And you'll find out later that the cost of this sort of coating was far too high, and in this case resulting in it only being applied to vital regions of the suit. The Big Rang was a Zeonic mobile armor deployed during the tail end of the 1-year war, featured in a Gundam series that only 14 of us have watched. Being an MA in Gundam usually implies size. Therefore, it's only natural to have many defensive options to prevent it from staying a giant target. Enter the 32 beam dispersal missile launcher. As the name implies, the missile launcher had a 6x5 array and featured missiles that could deploy beam dispersal screens strong enough to nullify Salamis class beam cannons for a limited time. As for pros, this method of beam protection is a lot more energy efficient compared to I-fields, which will be discussed later in the video in more detail, and was potent enough to block ship class beam cannons. For cons, it suffered from a limited window of protection due to finite ammo like the Zaku's pellets, along with the fact that they're dispersing in space, where objects in motion will continue unless interrupted, yada yada yada. The public class was a Federation space assault ship designed for hit-and-run tactics, deployed during the Battle of Solomon. They were equipped with beam diffusion missiles, which when fired, would disperse a particle curtain that was able to diffuse beam attacks from all directions. A strategic pro was the missiles allowed allied forces to close distance / advance under protection of an anti-beam curtain. However, a notable con was that, just like the Big Rang, it was too restricted due to finite ammo, and it only had limited beam protection. And in this case, it had a lower output tolerance for beams than the Big Rang's beam dispersal missiles. As the clip playing right now actually shows the beam curtain wearing out, resulting in one of the ships being destroyed by beam fire. Considered the biggest and most powerful mobile weapon in the 1-year war, the Big Zam was a powerhouse of a Zeonic mobile armor, deployed during the Battle of Abao Q. It introduced the UC timeline and the franchise at large to a staple in beam defense called the I field. I'm gonna read verbatim from the wiki since there's no realistic way to paraphrase this one. When Minovsky particles are released into the air or into open space, the positive and negative particles spontaneously align themselves into a 3-dimensional cubic lattice. Due to the repulsion and electrostatic forces between the Minovsky particles, this lattice functions as a kind of force field, which is referred to as an I field. This field has difficulty permeating conductive materials like metal, water, and plasma, and it exerts a repulsive force against megaparticles. An I field is used to deflect enemy megaparticle beams due to its high power requirements. The I field generator originally could only be installed into large mobile weapons. When the generator is activated, the I field forms an invisible barrier, remember this for later, around the mobile weapon, protecting it from incoming beam attacks. However, this barrier has no effect against solid objects like missiles and projectiles, and beam weapons can still be used at point-blank range within the barrier's boundary. For pros, this was the first dedicated beam defense equipped onto a mobile weapon in Gundam, and was able to protect the Big Zam from multiple and spontaneous shots from ship-class beam cannons with ease. For cons, as mentioned in the wiki blurb, it is extremely power intensive, and at the time could only be equipped on the large mobile weapons like mobile armors. That is, until the mid-UC 90s. Well, there's that one too. Another con not mentioned in the blurb for some fact, obvious reason, was I fields provided no defense against beam melee weapons. That is until Unicorn, but that's a completely separate can of worms. And I'll talk about that later, you can believe it. Oh yeah, I know the Big Zam, or Zams, show up in GQuuuuuX, but there's no way to get the clip of its I field digitally at the time of recording, so yeah, I didn't miss it, I just couldn't add it, so have this instead. Another Zeonic MA, this time a crustacean,
Monster.
developed during the late stages of the OYW. The Valwalo/Waro, depending on localization, made its debut in Stardust Memory Episode 7. It doesn't actually have a dedicated form of beam defense, therefore the wiki doesn't list one. However, what it does have is sloped armor, which is a lot more prevalent in Iron-Blooded Orphans. However, in this case it was able to shrug off 2 of the Zephyranti Bernern's beam rifle shots. Essentially, sloped armor in Gundam works the same way it does in real life, which is usually applied to military vehicles like tanks and naval ships. However, instead of only providing a degree of protection against ballistics/physical rounds, in Gundam the angled shape of the armor causes beam to be deflected off of the surface, as opposed to being penetrated. Notice how I only mentioned physicals and beam shots. What's missing? Oh, that's right, another form of combat in Gundam. Melee. Sloped armor did absolutely shit against beam sabers, and was ultimately what took down the mobile armor. Hey, just like the Big Zam. This marks the first Gundam/protagonist suit/mobile armor chronologically in UC to possess beam defense, in the form of an I field. The pros and cons are the same as they were for the Big Zam. However, in the Dendrobium's case, its I field was completely exposed on the left side, and was actually damaged and disabled by the next entry of this video. I just want to note the difference in animation quality between MSG and 0083. I included the Dendrobium onto the list despite covering I fields already, just to showcase how good 90s anime animation is. The Noyo Zeal was deployed during Operation Stardust, yet another Zeonic MA, however this time was equipped with 4 I field generators, 2 in the shoulders and 2 in the tail skirts, and much like the Dendrobium and Big Zam, its I fields worked in the same way. However, I included onto this list to show off the animation where the beam shot physically caused the MA to break, to highlight how beam has very inconsistent properties of acting like either light or semi-ballistic in the franchise. The first transformable mobile armor in the franchise, the Psycho Gundam was equipped with an anti-beam barrier, which helped it be an absolute unit during the Grips conflict. The pros and cons are pretty similar to those of an I field or ABC, however the limited screen time allocated to the Psycho Gundam results in very little information regarding its beam defensive limitations. And Force character arc. Yeah, I said it. She's equally as rushed as Lala, fight me. And much like an I field, the barrier didn't protect the Psycho Gundam from melee-based beam weaponry as well, which did ultimately take it down. The iconic golden mobile suit piloted by Notchar was equipped with beam-resistant coating. which was stacked on multiple layers of high specific heat capacity material onto armor, and made it into sacrificial protection against beam weapons, as it could only tolerate a few shots in the same area before getting destroyed. Something worth noting is throughout the duration of Zeta and Double Zeta, the Shiki was only depicted with a physical shield in this blasphemous non-canon work, and the best part is, that's not even its shield. However, there's also this non-canon but official illustration that shows what the Shiki's proper shield could have looked like, but it's a shame since none of the kits feature this, since it's a really neat design. That aside, you may be wondering why I went on a tangent about the Hyaku Shiki and physical shields, but don't worry, we'll get there. Right now! I believe it's implied that Quattro and by extension Bicha didn't sortie with shields due to the Shiki's ABC. For pros and cons, ABC being applied to the whole body made for a very expensive suit, and another weakness being it only provided a very limited degree of beam protection, as it was bypassing the clip playing right now. Not to mention the Shiki was actually defeated by beam weapons from a suit that will appear later in the video as well. And ultimately, it just wasn't worth the resources, and a full golden coat of ABC was phased out in all of animated UC. We won't be discussing the Hyaku Shiki Kai, the Hyaku Shiki Kai Mass Production, Hyaku Shiki Kai Full Armor, or the Delta Gundam in this video. And since they're non-animated MSVs and lack footage, but on the bright side, the golden armor looked cool as hell though. The titular mobile suit from Zeta Gundam makes its way into the list, but astute observer, you may be wondering, why is the
Yes, we got MSC, let's go!
on a list about beam defenses? It only has a standard physical shield. And for that, you'd be correct. It doesn't have a dedicated form of beam protection, but it does have a feat in the form of its biosensor. This marks the first entry onto the list I'll be referring to as magic, I meant atypical beam defense. Trust me, this one's tame compared to later UC ones. I'm classifying them as such because many of them lack any real explanation as to why they exist outside the blanket term of Herdermanutite. As seen on screen, it was able to effortlessly nullify multiple shots from Hambrabi, all while noted as being an ability beyond the specifications of the biosensor. But let's backtrack. What is the biosensor? Essentially, it was a system that allowed new type pilots a higher level of mental control over their suits, and it temporarily boosted the MS's power, speed, and strength, depending on the pilot's emotion and mental state. Regarding pros and cons, being an atypical defense, it's hard to say if it really has any cons, as it behaves differently from conventional defenses. However, in the MSV's case, it's heavily reliant on its pilot, as we never see Ru enter this awakened state during Double Zeta. For pros, its beam defensive capabilities are largely immeasurable, therefore I won't comment too much on that, aside from the fact the individual pilot's new type strengths and abilities heavily influence the behavior of the biosensor's beam barrier, which could be considered a weakness if your pilot isn't strong enough to unlock the suit's full potential, like Ru in particular. It is also noted that these abilities are not voluntarily controlled by the pilot, or else we would have seen Camille pull off something like this earlier in the series. Hailing in from the ever obscure series of Gundam Evolve, we have the Zeta Gundam. Again?
MSC!
The Zeta 3C, or Red Zeta, made its debut in episode 9 of Gundam Evolve, where it erected a barrier to protect itself from the Geminus's beam cannon shots. The explanation for said barrier is pretty esoteric in nature and lacks any entry on the wiki, other than a passing remark just acknowledging it as a barrier. Therefore, I'm gonna make an educated guess and say that this barrier was a byproduct of the Zeta 3C Psycho Neutralizer, which was an upgraded form of the biosensor that the OG Zeta had, that allowed the pilot to control the suit with high precision, and allowed it the first instance of Psy-Commu Jack, which if you don't know what those words mean, it's this. Being a Zeta equipped with an upgraded form of the biosensor would explain how Yuri was able to pull off similar feats to fellow female Camille. As the name implies, the upgraded Psycho Gundam from a few entries ago, now creatively called the Psycho Mark II, introduces us to the very first beam defense utilizing remote weapons. A unique aspect about the reflector bits compared to other past entries is that they weren't designed solely for defense, and actually were used offensively in the show as well. I'll discuss the pros and cons later when we reach the other UCMA that possess the same technology, as its on-screen feats were far more extensive than that of the Psycho Mark IIs. Based on the iconic Q-Blade piloted by the Q-Blade Mark II demonstrated another instance of an atypical beam defense. During her final showdown with, well, herself, Pool 1 was able to defend Judal from an unholy amount of spam from the Psycho Mark II. Unlike the two Zeta's feats, this phenomenon goes largely unexplained. However, in my professional and highly qualified opinion, it's likely due to the sheer new type ability that Pool 1 possessed at the time, coupled with her resolve and willpower to not only save Judal, but to stop Pool 2. Not too different from that of Girl's Name's resolve during his episode 49 feat, Milking my bit more, one of the contenders for most entertaining characters in Double Zeta makes an entry onto this list. I say Meshimar makes an appearance rather than his Zaku 3 custom because this feat isn't tied to the suit itself. Rather, it's due to his Cyber New type abilities, therefore making it, you guessed it, another atypical beam defense. The Zaku 3 custom lacks any semblance of Psychomu technology, and the barrier Meshimar created to counter the Dovin Wolves is easily inferred to be something similar to what his precious would pull off later on the list. The precursor of a certain fan favorite design that will be appearing pretty soon in the list, the Queen Mansa / Queen Mansa depending on localization, was deployed during the tail end of the first Neo-Zeon War as Pull 2's final mobile suit. Yes, I said mobile suit, not mobile armor. I too went years thinking that this was an MA, because I don't know, it being 42.1 meters tall or something. It was equipped with mega particle deflectors in each of its shoulder binders, which not only provided beam defensive capabilities, but also allowed the suit to reflect beams back at the enemies as an offensive countermeasure. Somewhat similar to a previous suit, as it was developed from both the GQuuuuuuX and Psycho Gundam. The Queen Mansa / Mantha had no real weaknesses, as it was only defeated while its defenses were down. The upgraded version of the titular mobile suit from Double Zeta was equipped with additional armor featuring anti-beam coating capable of withstanding standard output beam fire for 3 seconds straight. Remember this number for later. Pros: this is the first time we see this strong of a dedicated beam defense equipped onto a single non-MA sized suit like this, as it was able to completely nullify beam shots from the Dovin Wolf with ease. There was a slight flaw in the full armor configuration, however, as it hindered the Double Zeta's transformation and would have to be purged in order to re-access it. Piloted by another one of the funniest characters from Double Zeta, and yes, that is an extremely high bar. The Gameok was deployed near the end of the first Neo-Zeon War, and like the Q-Blade Mark II and Zaku 3, didn't have any special onboard systems like the biosensor that allowed it to block beams. However, the barrier on screen counts as another atypical form of beam defense that is, for better or for worse, pretty prevalent in the quartet barring Mobile Suit Gundam. Being an atypical barrier, its limits are unknown. However, a nitpicked weakness is that the gas R in the clip was shot down since the barrier's size only accommodated the Gameok. Finally, for the last entry of Double Zeta, we have the Q-Blade piloted by none other than herself. The Q-Blade was a very special case when it came to atypical beam defenses because it is the only one with an actual name, albeit kind of unofficial, which can be found in the little known 2007 game called SCGO. That's one of the first gacha games ever for all of you gambling fiends out there. In it, the Q-Blade has an S-rank form where its weapon 1 in mode 1 was called Cycle Field, which heavily increased its beam defense for 7 seconds, and for no reason at all, did a ton of damage. I luckily still have access to the game via servers since the game's EOS was in 2015, but feel free to believe that I time traveled 10 years to record this footage for you. Back to the Cycle Field itself in the context of Double Zeta, in the final episode, is this bit annoying yet? Was able to tank an overclocked high mega cannon for 20 seconds straight. Obviously the Q-Blade did take damage as a result of this, however it's extremely impressive considering how powerful the HMC was at this point of the UC timeline. Being yet another atypical beam defense, the info on the Cycle Field is pretty lacking, however it's implied that it was powered and strengthened by Haman's overwhelming strength as a new type. Haman-sama. You thought you were safe. Okay, finally I get to talk about Japan's official favorite Gundam. Deployed during the second Neo-Zeon War, the new Gundam introduced the franchise to a brand new form of beam defense, in the form of the fin funnel barrier, which utilized the fin funnel's ability to compress megaparticles to create a beam barrier. In the movie, Amuro deployed it in a pyramid array and was able to defend against multiple beam shots from the Alpha Zero's funnels, along with repelling them from entering the barrier, which gives it an edge over a standard eye field. Pros include the fact that this was an actual conventional beam defense designed for a single suit, and as we saw, it improved upon a weakness of the eye field, while allowing the new Gundam to shoot through his own barrier. Another pro that wasn't shown off in the movie was, being tied to remote weapons allows the barrier to be shaped and altered to create practically limitless coverage while in space. However, for cons, it was breached by the Alpha Zero's mega particle gun, implying that the defensive capabilities are lower than that of a standard eye field. Since, fun fact, an eye field has never actually been breached by beams within the proper Gundam series, and the only time ever was in build fires, which I'll get to when we reach that part of the video. Another con is that the new Gundam's fin funnels are technically misnomers, since they can't actually recharge, unlike its completed version, therefore resulting in limited operational time for them, and by extension the barrier as well. Another related fun factish If you've ever wondered what the difference is between funnels and bits in Gundam, generally the rule of thumb is that funnels can be re-racked and recharged, while bits cannot. I'm not even going to delve into the can of worms that are the fangs, dragoons, gun bits, staves, etc. That being said, the exact technology for the fin funnel barrier would never be recreated one-to-one in Gundam again. However, there would be some derivatives in later UC and in the Cosmic Era. We're back to Visual with another atypical form of beam defense. But hey, this time it's completely independent of its suit. What the previous entries all had in common were that they either had dedicated onboard Psycommu systems and or new type pilots. However, that's not the case with the Regazi. Instead, it has a beam blocking feat purely because Chan happened to have the cycle frame itself with her at the time of piloting, which blocked a shot from the Alpha Zero. Honestly, this feat is just so... there. That it's hardly ever acknowledged or elaborated upon, and don't get me started on why it didn't protect her from the Jegan's beam rifle shots literally seconds afterward. With this entry, we're rapidly approaching the magic territory. Okay, these next few entries, I'm gonna go a little out of order when it comes to chronology, because Unicorn's beam defenses go from pretty normal to outright silly. So I'm gonna save it and Banshee for the end of this mini segment of the video. With that being said, we're already starting off the silliness with a fan favorite design with the Kshatriya. Created as a downscaled Queen Mansa, the Kshatriya helps us return to normalcy with an actual dedicated beam defense after the onslaught of the quartet. Finally, we're back to a standard bread and butter staple in the form of I-fields. The Kshatriya houses 4 I-field generators, one in each of its binders, which behaved not like I-fields. It blocked the beam saber. It's also worth noting that in episode 1, while I know a lot of people consider this to be an I-field feat, it looks completely different from the block in episode 2, which makes me inclined to believe that Marita just pushed back the Stark Jegan for thrusters, clearly due to the difference in animation VFX. I hope this video clears up the confusion in future discussions. It won't. If you remember how earlier I said I-fields can't protect against beam sabers, it's only gonna get more as we keep going forward into Unicorn. Speaking of differences in animation VFX, the Rosa Zulu, for whatever reason, had its VFX downgraded between episode 5 and 6 for its Mega Beam Shield. I think it's worth noting that in the completely pointless and useless Unicorn Recut TV series, it uses the episode 6 edit for the shield, but in my opinion, it just looks way worse since a major downgrade. Rambling aside, this is the first time we get to see an I-field being used to bolster a suit's offensive range capabilities, as the Mega Beam Shield's Mega Particle Cannons are scattered by the onboard I-field in order to give it a bigger AoE when shooting. Slightly unrelated, but Bandai? What the hell is this? Why is it brown? Oh, that's better. Much like the Falvaro/Wallow, we have another crustacean-inspired Xionic mobile armor. This time, equipped with reflector bits just like the Psycho Mark II. While including it feels redundant, these specific bits have rotors, also have way more screen time to explore their feats. While in the novel, the Shamblo has an I-field, the show completely dropped that concept in favor of these bits. To me in the middle, the EXVS series gave it a visible frontal barrier instead. I think the Shamblo's most noteworthy feat with its reflector bits is when Loni blocked their own beam cannon shot from hitting Zoe Demo-kun and Riddy. Other than that, the reflector bits behave pretty similarly to those of the Psycho Mark IIs. While not necessarily a weakness, we actually do get to see the reflector bits' limits when they were being overwhelmed by not only the Shamblo's own beam cannon shot, but also by the beam magnum shot that penetrated not only the reflectors, but the beam cannon shot was blocking, and the Shamblo itself. Next up, we have another red mobile armor in the form of the Neo Zeong, which was equipped with 4 I-field generators, 2 in the front of the waist and 2 in the back. Immediately, a con of this specific I-field setup is that it doesn't actually provide full coverage for the mobile armor, as we see the deflected beam magnum shots hit the Neo Zeong's stern boosters, causing them to explode. Another I-field entry in the list feels redundant. I added it purely because the animation of it blocking shots, where it looks like the shots curve around the spherical barrier, is just completely different from any other I-fields depicted in the franchise thus far, and for that alone was interesting enough for me to include it. Okay, this next entry is going to be here for 2 reasons. 1, because the VFX is just too good to ignore, and 2, to tease a possible upcoming video that I'm working on regarding beam attenuation, where I'll be doing a deep dive into what beam attenuation is and the implications of power levels when it comes to the various beam color outputs in Gundam. Either that or I'll be making a video on the best piece of media ever made. Hey, if you're watching this in the future where the video's already out, please comment how long the time difference was between these two videos, cause this one, at the point of writing, is entering its 5th month of production. Anyway, essentially these work in the same way as the public class and the big ranks missiles, but I added this specific anti-beam missile style defense because these ones are also shown to affect beam blades as well, rather than just shots only. Okay, we're finally here. I guess I have to talk about it. Let me preface this by saying, Unicorn Gundam's eye fields, I know, I said plural, are absolute special. Allow me to explain. Episode 1, it erects one while transforming into destroy mode. So far so good, right? Episode 2, it's revealed that it has an eye field generator in its physical shield. Okay, still good, right? A little redundant, but admittedly cool technology nonetheless. Okay, what could go wrong? Episode 3. If you just watched this and asked, how the hell did it take damage, with knowledge that it had an eye field in episode 1? Congratulations, you've been paying attention. Cause how the little f did Soridemo-kun take damage in this instance, when he has not 1, but 2 eye fields? In destroy mode nonetheless. If you argue, oh, the first instance was only deployed into the transformation sequence, it'd still be stupid, cause there's a scene in episode 3 that shows that his shield mounted eye field behaves just like any other, in a sense as a 360-degree spherical barrier. You know, the type of defense that covers every angle. If you thought it couldn't get sillier, no, it does! Unicorn's eye fields can block from beam sabers! Why? I don't know! It shouldn't, but it does! If you don't believe me and think that this instance is just the Unicorn's physical shield blocking the San Andreas Beamax, no! The green indicator ring around the eye field generator lights up, just like in episode 2. Not only that, this happens! What the hell is even that? Like, obviously this isn't as lore-breaking as Superman Leia, but wow, the Unicorns team really took some liberties when it came to eye fields. And I think that's poo from a butt. Okay, surely it can't get worse than that, right? Right? Okay, after the lobotomy-inducing rant that was the Unicorn's magical eye field, let's tone it slightly down with an eye field that fundamentally ignores the eye and eye field. The Ahava Azeru is a mobile armor from an obscure show that only 12 of us have watched. And in episode 6, its eye field just isn't eye.
If the show's called Invincible, then why can I see it?
It also just looks like a more generic barrier from other mecha anime. I don't dislike it. In fact, I think it looks pretty neat. But that's another tally onto the board of times UC90's Health Cup eye fields. Okay, before we go to narrative, I need to make a passing remark that the Delta Zayin from Silver Phantom has an eye field shield, but I don't own a VR headset, cause I'll be living under a bridge if this video underperforms. So I can't include any footage. Anyway, going to NT. My suffering truly never ends. Because the second Neo Zeong has an eye field identical to that of his predecessor, and except this time, the VFX just looked terrible in comparison with Unicorns, whose episode 7 came out 4 years before NT did. But hey, on the bright side, Zoten did an absolute job using the strongest mobile armor in all of Gundam, unlike Full Frontal did. So that's gotta count for something, right? Other than that, the second Neo Zeong was able to localize its eye field, which may or may not have been an upgraded ability from the second to second MA. Though the same weakness of non-full coverage still carried over to the second Neo Zeong. Though again, I'm gonna be honest, I just included it in here to bash narrative's animation quality for the memes, but this next one is just, I'm done. Cycle frame parts can just block beams now. Cause why not, right? There's not much to say. It's atypical, it's goofy, I hate it. Let's just finally get out of the UC90s already. What year is this? We're finally back to conventional beam defenses? These next 2 entries aren't necessarily limited to F91 only, but I just wanted to talk about his beam shield in general because it's all encompassing. The beam shield was a revolutionary piece of technology when it came to Gundam, as we see it become a new staple in every UC work set after F91, such as Victory, and that Essentially, it worked off the same principle of a beam saber. Instead, it was spread out into a plane rather than a cylinder. What made it so effective was it not only protected against beams, but also ballistic fire as well, along with the added benefit of reducing a mobile suit's weight by literal tons for not having to lug giant physical shields around. F91 was the first Gundam work to introduce us to the technology and did a pretty bang-up job demonstrating its different functionalities, such as being able to collapse certain segments for different combat scenarios. In F91's case, it could double as a beam blade and was even used in an activated state as a feint, but that's more of a testament of how much of a monster pilot Seabook was. Though, with every good beam defense, there was always drawbacks, but in the beam shield's case, it was understandable given what it was up against. In the movie, the Gundam F91, not the movie Gundam F91, but the F91 Gundam F91, this is what happens when you make the codename and model number match Kunio Akawara! Anyway, the F91 was able to penetrate beam shields, not only with his variable speed beam rifle, which were designed to do just that, but also with his beam rifle. Make no mistake, the defensive capabilities for individual suits with beam shields still mog anything in prior UC, except maybe the Unicorn's magic shields. Tangent time! I know in the beginning of the video I said I wouldn't cover manga. I lied. I just had to include chapter 17 of the Crossbone manga, where Kincaid/Seabook had to throw 2 of his beam shields and use his beam Zanber just to block a single Visper shot. This not only demonstrates just how strong the Visper's penetrative abilities were, but also primes us for feats regarding beam blades being used defensively as well, which will be further elaborated later in the video. Modeled after the flower with the single largest bloom in the world, the Rafflesia is equipped with an eye-field generator, and behaves exactly like any of the others I've covered in the video. I only really included it to be thorough, and to show you the evolution of animation throughout the years for the same technology. Granted, this would make a lot more sense if I went in production order. But it's my video. That and my brain had to take a break from talking about Unicorn. On to the final work of UC, not counting G Savior since the beam shields in there are no different from in here or F91. We had the various Zandscare mobile suits such as the Zolo, Zolo Kai, Shokyu, Rig Shokyu, etc. with their beam rotors, which were essentially beam helicopter blades that were based on beam shields. Unlike traditional shields though, the beam rotors also assisted with flight and combat, all while acting like standard beam shields, even with the collapsible segments. While this is the first and last series we get to see the beam rotor in, later in Anno Domini, we get to see something that shares the same design philosophy as it. While we're on the topic of Zandscare, the Rig Shokyu also had a beam fan, which is essentially a fanned out beam saber that could also be used defensively against beam shots as well. A first for the list, a ship makes an entry with the Reinforced Junior and his beam shield. During the Victory era of UC, larger caliber beam shields started getting equipped on the ships. However, the Reinforced Juniors is a bit special since its shield had another function outside of defending. Once all of the emitters were positioned forward, it would create what was known as the beam ram, for the purpose of, well, as the name implies, ramming, which essentially was a massive beam saber on a ship. And that's awesome. Phew. We're finally on to our last Gundam in the UC segment, and what better way to close off this portion of the video with, in my opinion, the king of beam defenses in UC. The Victory 2 Gundam Assault Buster was an absolute powerhouse of a Gundam that appeared near the end of the Zandscare War, and was armed to the teeth with both offensive and defensive equipment. It also kind of acts like a full package of the various UC technologies that came before it. The V2 Gundam itself had 2 arm-mounted beam shields. All of the golden armor of the assault configuration had ABC. If that wasn't enough, the shoulder units housed eye-field generators, and to bolster the assault's survivability, it was equipped with a mega beam shield, which is essentially a scaled-down planar version of the new Gundam's fin funnel barrier that could also be used under gravity, and the cherry on top being the wings of light, which were able to be used defensively and offensively, along with being able to create an EMP effect against enemies. The V2AB had every single staple of beam defense I've mentioned thus far, except anti-beam missiles, but at that point it'd be more excessive than it already is. And with that, that was every single unique form of beam defense in Universal Century. Next I'll be talking about the various entries from all of the alternate timeline works. Okay, finally, I get to talk about AUs. After discussing the same 4 beam defenses in all of UC, we get to talk about the fun and wacky zany ones. That, and I'm pretty biased towards AUs in general, since like most American Gundam fans, I was introduced through Wing in the not too distant year of 2000. So not only is my memory of certain defenses more thorough, it was also a lot easier for me to go back to certain episodes to get specific clips of some of these. With that being said, the year is 1994, and Nelson Mandela just became the president of South Africa. Scouring through the future century timeline for dedicated beam defenses, the only one I could find were the barriers used in the Hong Kong arc of the G Gundam, notably featured in episode 33. They were designed to protect civilians as they watched Gundam fights, and were shown to be able to block the John Bull Gundam's long beam rifle shots. Not necessarily a weakness, but in that same episode, it was shown that certain parts of the barrier could be manually deactivated, which endangered the Neil France team. This next one is kind of an atypical beam defense, but at the same time it's not really since it's G Gundam. It's the Neo Japan Colony defensive barrier, which was able to block a literal colony laser blast from the Statue of Liberty Is that 5-star General Douglas MacArthur? Considered the strongest weapon of Neo America, the Statue of Liberty cannon blasted a massive yellow beam at Neo Japan. If you haven't watched G Gundam yet, and you're hearing this all for the first time, I apologize if I sound insane, but please bear with me. Neo Japan's defensive barrier was actually able to completely nullify the colony laser equivalent blast, which is a huge feat, rivaling that of, There's literally no info on what this defensive system actually is at all, but it's G Gundam, so who cares? It's awesome. But yeah, that's all there was from FC. And to be honest, I'm surprised there were even any, since most of the show is just hand-to-hand combat. Okay, fair warning, the portion on After Colony is going to be pretty lengthy, since I'm going to do a mini deep dive into Gundanium alloy and why it shouldn't be slept on so much when it comes into discussions. With that being said, let's tackle one of the first real unique AU defenses in the form of Planet Defensors, which created an electromagnetic barrier to not only block beams but also physical ammunition as well. In the series, Planet Defensors function as extremely potent defensive equipment for mainly the Virgos and by extension, the Mercuryus and Virgo 2s. They effectively revolutionized the battlefield, since most older Oz models literally had no countermeasures against them besides kamikazing and resorting to unga bunga punching. With all of this praise, let's talk about the pros and cons. Without a doubt, Planet Defensors were capable of easily blocking anything from beam rifles, cannons, machine guns, and missiles. They were also rechargeable and worked under gravity, and when paired with other Virgos, they could expand their coverage proportionally to how many units were conjoined. Additionally, being remote weapons, they could be deployed to defend friendly units as well. However, they weren't completely As mentioned before, a standard MS Fist would do the job. The biggest weakness of the Planet Defensors were that they could be easily bypassed by physical melee weapons. No, it's not your turn yet. Additionally, highly concentrated beam-based weapons would work too, such as the Supersonic Transporter's laser cannons in episode 30, or the laser cannons equipped on the Tauruses in episode 41. Wait. That looks suspiciously like the bullpup machine guns from UC. Also, it's shown that with sufficient output, Planet Defensors could be overwhelmed. Such a thing happened in episode 30 when Ketra used the Wing Gundam's bus rifle at implied max output to erase a full-on hillside of Virgos. That and its standard output twin bus rifle shot from the Wing Zero was enough as well. Kinda as a testament in the fact that the twin bus rifle, despite its name, was clearly over twice as strong as the vanilla Wing Gundam's bus rifle. The upgraded form of a fan favorite design, the Deathscythe helped possess the active cloak, in the form of 4 field generators, housed in large wing units that could shield the Gundam with an admittedly poncho look. No, it's not your turn yet. Not only were they able to generate force fields similar to that of the Planet Defensors, but the wings themselves are also coated with anti-beam coating. Hey look, it's back! Okay, I lied. I'm gonna break a rule here I set up at the beginning of the video. Because the Sandrock Customs anti-beam cloak did show up on screen, just never defended against a single beam shot in the anime ever. Needless to say, it still looked cool as hell, and makes up for my hypocrisy for not including Crossbone's ABC cloak. Okay, this technically isn't a dedicated beam defense, but allow me to glaze it up a bit, because it's the only armor in Gundam that's able to easily tank beam rifle shots without being overly specialized, unlike CE, AG, and PD. Trust me, we'll get there. Hot take time. The Gundanium alloy, found on Gundams, not the weaker version of mobile suits like the Virgo and Mercury's and V8, is the single best armor in all of Gundam. Why? To get the obvious out of the way, it is extremely durable, and straight up never took damage from ballistic fire ever on screen. And no, I'm not counting Endless Waltz. You can't in good faith take the armor feats from the series and transfer it to EW without straight up logic leaps. For the sake of this argument, you just need to treat it as an artistic reimagining of the armor to make the stakes higher. Especially since there are scenes where the same events occur, but are just reimagined. Not counting Glory of the Losers either here, this is anime only, not the questionably canon manga hour. Back to the main point, Gundanium is extremely lightweight, and completely shock-proof as well. Though, to make it fair, I'll be mentioning a few notable instances where its durability shines, along with providing a devil's advocate argument of what counts as plot armor in Gundam Wing, cause let's be real, the plot armor is genuinely an armor grading when it comes to this show. Let's start by highlighting all of the times where Gundanium alloyed Gundams have been damaged in any meaningful way first, so that I don't sound too overly biased. As for why I'm excluding Virgo 1s and 2s along with the Mercus and Vey 8, quick history lesson time. There was a website called Gundam Official back in the early 2000s, which is now Gundam Info. But before, the site had official stats for the AC mobile suits. And among the stats was armored ability. Using the data from this archive, we can see that the Sandrock had the highest durability at 160, followed by a tie between Wing Zero, Epyon, Heavy Arms, and Death Scythe Hell at 140, and Wing Gundam at 130, and tie for last place between Death Scythe, Shenlong, and Ultron at 120. Okay, now that we know the Gundam stats, let's speed run through some of the mobile suits. The Ares had 90, Leo, Cancer, Pisces, and Magnet all had 100, Tragos and Taurus at 110, and the Togis 1 and 2 at 120. All suits being made of titanium alloy, which we know is inferior to Gundanium. But what about the Gundanium alloyed mobile suits? Well, the Mercus and Vey 8 both had 130, which is higher than both the Death Scythe and Shenlong, however still skew lower on the spectrum. However, given that the Mercus and Vey 8 were the blueprints for the mass-produced Virgo and Virgo 2s, which had 120, it's very easy to infer that the refinement of their Gundanium is lesser than that of the alloys used in the Gundams and the Mercus and Vey 8. Because, A, the Virgos only match the Tallgeese' titanium alloy defensive stat, despite having more robust armor plates. And B, being mass-produced certainly implies lesser refinements. So with that being said, I'm only going to discuss the 5 Operation Meteor Gundams, their upgrades, Wing Zero, and Epyon only. Also, obviously no, I'm not counting opening 1, since that literally never happened in the show. Fair warning, given the plot armory nature of Gundam Wing, some of the durability feats are going to be pretty inconsistent and will likely contradict each other, so keep that in mind. Starting with the first time a Gundam from AC was ever defeated without the usage of self-destruction, the Gundam Death Scythe's first space battle in episode 19 resulted in it being disabled after having its right arm completely blasted off by a Taurus' beam cannon. And later, in its public execution in the following episode, it was actually destroyed by that same weapon. Another time a Gundam was damaged was during Shenlong's space battle against the Barge/Bulge, just depending on localization, in the same episode, where its extended arm was blasted off by Barge/Bulge's main cannon, and then Wu Fei enacted some self-inflicted damage to escape using his beam glaive. Even though this was an instance showing the limitations of Gundanium, I still find it incredibly impressive, considering that Shenlong was completely immersed by the Barge/Bulge's main cannon, and only its arm was destroyed. Which, to be fair, had lower durability since it was in its extended dragon arm configuration. The next instance was in episode 33, where Wing Gundam's leg gets disabled by a Virgo beam cannon. Quick counter argument though, not really, but the fact that the leg wasn't completely destroyed and was only disabled is actually a testament to how strong Gundanium really is, since every other mobile suits were getting absolutely one-shotted by Virgo beam cannons by this point in the show. Okay, this next one I can't really defend, since it should be tougher than Death Scythe and Shenlong, but in episode 44, Heavy Arms Kai's right arm is destroyed by a Virgo 2's beam cannon. In episode 46, Wing Gundam gets destroyed by Libra's main cannon, which mind you, is an island level blast. Clearly Wing Gundam didn't block or nullify the beam at all, however the fact that it wasn't atomized, despite being completely enveloped in the beam, is actually bonkers levels of durability. Oh, that and Ladian survive unscathed. Okay, finally in episode 49, Epyon loses his left arm against Wing Zero, and the latter loses part of his right shoulder armor, and later its cheek guard during re-entry. And yes, that's technically the official name for it. Granted, 2 of these were from beam saber damage, so it's kind of understandable since there's only a single armor grading and Gundam actually explicitly designed to counter beam sabers. And those were all the instances where Gundanium armor was breached, and or destroyed in any meaningful way. Now on to the bunch of times Gundanium absolutely proved it was a powerhouse in armor grading. Again, I only included notable Gundanium Gundam feats and not Virgo Vey, etc. Or else we'd be here for 5 hours. But mostly because we discussed prior, they generally have lower armor grading compared to their dual-censored adversaries. In episode 1, Wing Gundam absolutely eats 4 missiles directly to its back. And the animators went out of their way to include a shine effect afterwards to show that absolutely no damage was taken. This is super impressive considering had that happened to nearly any other mainline Gundam, barring phase shift armor, they'd actually be destroyed by missiles to the back, but Wing Gundam tanked it like a champ. Next, in episode 13, Heavy Arms does a cool flip to block Leo's shoulder beam cannon shots. Granted, there are scratches on it, but the cannons have one-shotted Leo's before. Granted, Leo's explode from being looked at too hard. But still, that's another point for Gundanium since the leg didn't even get destroyed. Speaking of heavy arms, in episode 16, it is the only Gundam ever to repeatedly tank beam saber slashes. Not 1 or 2, but 7 beam saber swings from the Tallgeese. Not a beam defense feat, but Sandrock in episode 17 withstood a barrage of machine gun fire for 8 seconds straight and still took no damage, and only ended up flinching a bit. Which shouldn't be surprising since Sandrock took the least amount of damage out of all of the suits in Wing, proving its highest armor stat isn't just a number. Okay, time for the one I've been really itching to talk about for years now. In Wing Zero's debut episode, 24, it gets shot 44 times by beam rifles. Not machine guns, beam rifles. Quite literally no other standard armor in Gundam would be able to withstand that kind of punishment. Not only that, Wing Zero takes absolutely no damage from this either. This is a literal insane durability feat when taken at face value. And honestly, the primary reason why I even made a section on Gundanium for a video mainly about dedicated beam defense, just for how crazy durable it is. Moving on. In episode 34, Wing Zero has another crazy feat where it's literally bombed. Not only did it survive, but it was unscathed too. Okay, Ultron's kinda whack, but then again, so is Wu Fei, lmao. In episode 40, Wu Fei tanks an unrealistically giant beam cannon shot from Libra. No, not its main cannon, just one of the smaller ones. But it didn't get destroyed, rather just minorly damaged. 2 episodes later, Ultron takes sustained fire from multiple Virgo 2 beam rifles for 11 seconds straight, and didn't get destroyed. Rather, he only got his left arm disabled. And actually based on animation, didn't retain the scratches afterward, but that's likely an animation error. Because sure, it's not as crazy as Wing Zero's durability feat, but this becomes abundantly more impressive when you remember that Wu Fei didn't receive any repairs, maintenance, or resupplying between episode 40 and 42. Remember, Ultron and Shenlong share defensive stats at the bottom tier of Gundanium, and still could pull that off. Okay, with all of those out of the way, you may be wondering, what was the whole point of this 1,000 plus word tangent for? And that'd be because I absolutely need newer Gundam fans to recognize just how strong of an armor Gundanium alloy really is, at the same time as pointing out the fact that it's really inconsistent and probably should be viewed skeptically to avoid biases. For example, Heavy Arms can take beam saber hits out the wazoo, but Epyon can't, and Wing is really notorious for these inconsistencies. Just look at the infamous Leo scenes from episode 18 and 23, where Treize takes direct machine gun fire in a Leo for 21 seconds, and Duel gets shot in the back multiple times by beam rifles and survives. What I'm trying to say is, given all the clips you've just watched, good and bad, the point is Gundanium is generally extremely robust and shouldn't be discounted when discussing durability feats in Gundam. And with that out of the way, let's move on to our next timeline. A giant mobile suit developed by the UNE, the Gabble, no, not you, appeared in episode 28 of Gundam X and possessed the only on-screen beam defense feat in all of the after-war timeline. Allegedly, the Petulio had an anti-beam field generator, but there's absolutely no footage of it being used in the single episode that it appears in. Not to mention, it didn't even showcase it in episode 11 of Buildfire's Try either. That aside, the Gabbo is equipped with 2 beam deflection field generators, one in each shoulder, and proved to be a challenge for the Frieden crew, as 3 out of 4 of their Gundams were heavily reliant on beam output. Interestingly enough, there's one instance where Jamio uses the X-Divider's beam machine gun against the Gabbo, only for the shots to result in 0 damage. I mention this because if you watch closely, the Gabbo doesn't actually have its field on. This is just its raw armor tanking the shots, hence the explosion afterward. Being a conventional beam defense, pros and cons are present of course. For pros, it was able to take on fire from all 4 of the Frieden's Gundams with no problem. Albeit, I think the twin satellite cannon would have been able to puncture it, but that's just an educate I guess. However, similar to I-fields in UC, weaknesses of the Gabo's field generators included ballistics and point-blank fire, which is actually how it was defeated. Luckily, the Frieden had access to the Gundam Leopard, which had a sufficient arsenal of missiles and grenades to create an opening for Royby to close the distance to use his beam gatling and grenade launcher at point-blank range to disable the fuel generators, which allowed Witz, Jammo, and Garrod to finish off the Gabo with their beam weapons. Well, that wraps it up for AEW. I'll be skipping Turn A for now, since that's technically chronologically in the end, but at the same time, it won't be at the end of this video, since there's still the build series to talk about as well, which have a weird spot in the larger timeline. The year is 2002, and the towers have been rubble for a year now, and we finally made it to the Cosmic Era, the only other timeline with sufficiently fleshed out technology compared to UC, largely due to the fact that it has the most runtime to do so. That being said, there will be a few repeat and equivalent defenses from UC here, mainly because the technological explanations will be different. Starting CE off strong, we have the Light Wave Barrier, or better known as the Umbrella of Artemis, which makes its appearance in episode 5 and 6 of Gundam Seed, and has somewhat of a minor role in the recent Seed Freedom movie. Essentially, it was a large 360-degree energy field that blocked both physical and beam weapons. While we never get to see the upper limit of its protective capabilities, the Umbrella was theorized to be virtually and its only weakness was the fact that anything inside was trapped inside. So when the shield was dropped for crafts to enter and exit, the emitters were vulnerable to incoming attacks, such as the beam saber of the Blitz Gundam, or, you know, an invisible Zigok in space. Equipped on the iconic Archangel class, the anti-beam depth charges were one of the few anti-beam countermeasures the ship possessed. They act not too differently from the anti-beam missiles in UC, except in the depth charges case, they absorb beam particles as opposed to diffusing them, and were shown nullifying shots from the Buster Gundam's rifle in episode 5. Their strengths and weaknesses mirror that of their UC counterparts, with the whole finite ammo and limited protection due to its spread type deal. Another one of the Archangel's anti-beam countermeasures, laminate armor, was the outer layer of armor that was used to disperse the thermal energy of a beam attack across the armor. Even though it debuted in the Archangel, it would find its way onto the Izumo class, along with seeing MS installations onto the 105 dagger and Buster dagger, where it was applied to certain parts of the body, kinda like the Goof Custom. It was also applied onto the physical shields just like the ones used by the Justice and Freedom 2. If you thought this all sounded familiar, you'd be right. Laminate armor is essentially CE's answer to the UC's ABC. That's a lot of letters I just said. There were limits to the laminate armor though. With sufficient beam fire, the heat threshold that it could withstand would be bypassed and result in vulnerability, which is seen here when the Blitz absolutely spams the shit out of this specific part under the bridge. Not to be confused with the type of bridge that I'll be living under if this video underperforms. Speaking of anti-beam coating, I lied. CE actually has that too, independent from laminate armor, and was applied to shields as well. For example, in this clip onto the Strike Gundam shield in episode 11 and later in episode 20. I'd show more clips of the ABC shields in CE, but something we'd be here for 6 hours. Anti-beam coating in CE doesn't actually have a dedicated entry on the wiki. However, the on-screen feats lead one to believe that it behaves nearly, if not completely identical to its UC counterpart. Onto a truly unique form of beam defense, we have the Forbidden Gundam's energy deflection armor, called the Geschmeidig Panzer. Unlike the previous entries, which mainly included diffraction, dispersion, diffusion, or nullification, Forbidden's shield binders granted it a form of beam reflection, where for the first time in Gundam, beam shots were actually seen warping. This is kinda unrelated to the technical side of things, but let me tell you, when Seed first aired, this wish was cool as f***, and it still is. It works by using strong magnetic fields to hold colloid particles above the shield binders that redirect beams away from its surface. As far as strengths go, the shields were shown reflecting Freedom Gundam's plasma cannons, which are much higher output compared to a standard beam rifle. So I'd say it was capable of defending against any low to above average tier beams. That being said, the Geschmeidig Panzers weren't designed to take on ballistic fire, and certainly wasn't meant to take on beam blades. As we see, it got damaged by Justice's beam boomerangs in episode 42. Granted, later in the episode we see it still functioning properly when reflecting beams, despite what looks like to be its emitters getting badly fucked up.
Enhance.
In episode 37, Kira uses the Freedom's railguns to stagger the Forbidden. Granted, it still has transshift armor, which means it can tank ballistic fire, but this is mainly to highlight that the energy deflection armor wasn't designed for physical protection. And finally, a major weakness of it was the fact that the Forbidden Gundam was a battery-powered MS. Along with its plasma beam cannons, the Geschmeidig Panzer required a ton of energy to power. And if used too often, like in the show, the Gundam's battery would be drained. Though this was offset by the fact that the rest of the Forbidden's arsenal consisted of physical weaponry, in the form of Vulcans, arm-mounted machine guns, railguns, and a Straif. But even with all that, Shawnee was seen running out of power before his fellow crackheads. Speaking of crackheads, the next entry onto the list is the Raider Gundam. Okay, fine. It doesn't technically have a dedicated beam defense per se, however, its spherical breaker, when spun, was not only able to block beam shots, but also ballistic fire as well, seen in episode 45. It's not explicitly stated, but I think it's heavily implied that the wire of the hammer is coated with ABC. But hey, that's just a speculation. But it's speculation from me, which means it's 100% fact. For cons, this one's pretty obvious. While not being an atypical defense, I can't in good faith call it conventional either, since having to spin a ball and chain mace around to defend against beam weapons is pretty, let's be real, sad. That and the fact that the Raider Gundam has an actual shield, though it would be more justified once we get to the advanced generation. Besides the anti-beam coated shield, Freedom doesn't actually possess any form of beam defense. However, in Gundam Seed episode 43 and 48, and a few more instances later on in Seed Destiny cause stock footage lmao, Kira was shown diffracting beam shots with his beam saber, parentheses S. Quick fun fact time. Did you know, throughout all of Seed and Seed Destiny, beam sabers never clash? That's why you see them hitting shields mostly. And no, this doesn't count. Scenes in the openings that don't happen in the show proper are not canon. How many times do I have to say this? Point is, beam blades just didn't clash. That is, until Seed Freedom, where you see it for the first time in CE. This is likely due to the different type of beam technology used in the Foundation suits, resulting in them having the only pure red output in the timeline. Wait, what do you mean these are both Compass and Zaf suits? I'm gonna ignore that forever. That aside, not really much of an explicit reasons given for this phenomenon, rather just speculation that Beam Saber tech and CE is just completely different from any other timeline, and if beam blades were to meet, they'd pass through each other. But as far as I know, this is fan speculation only, so take that with a grain of salt. The Genesis' beam defense is phase shift. That was the end of the sentence. Yeah, you know the armor system prominently featured throughout CE on Gundam suits, meant for near nullification of kinetic weapons? Yeah, that phase shift. It's a beam defense of the Genesis. In episode 48 of CE, the Genesis is shown blocking positron blaster cannons from the Kusanagi and Eternal. In case your memory of positron blasters are spotty, they shoot antimatter. Let that sink in. Anyway, there's not much in the realm of explanation as to why the Genesis is able to produce this feat of defensive achievement, but given that it's the largest thing to be equipped with phase shift in the whole timeline, some, including myself, have drawn to the conclusion that the Genesis having access to a far larger power source than a GAT-X battery or a neutron jammer canceller style reactor results in it being able to strengthen and reinforce the phase shift armor to an absurd degree, allowing it to block multiple antimatter shots. I know it sounds insane, but it's Gundam Seed. So, we've successfully made out of Seed, and now we're into Seed Destiny. With our first entry being the Destroy Gundam, which sort of uses a deviated form of the light wave barrier of the Artemis in the form of large beam shields called positron reflector shields. As the name implies, these beam shields were strong enough to nullify fire from a positron blaster cannon like the Lorhengrin and Tannhauser of the Archangel and Minerva respectively. I should note that these shields could be found on 3 other mobile armors in the Euclid, Gelsge, and Zamzaza, along with the Drake class. Hey look, a UC parallel! Additionally, it was a defensive option for large structures like the Requiem and Messiah. But I made the primary entry for positron reflectors for the Destroy Gundam, as it had one shield on its back, and another pair that were mounted on its detachable arms, that could fly around and defend and attack. That aside, I want to call attention to these 2 scenes from Seed Destiny. If that reminded you of the Forbidden Gundam, you wouldn't be alone. The VFX are nearly identical. However, nowhere does it mention that the Destroy Gundam possesses any form of the energy deflection armor, so nobody really knows why it warped both beams and railgun shots. The positron reflectors weren't even deployed in the scene either, yet the reflection kinda just happens. Anyway, being able to block positrons is no laughing matter. However, the units that possess these types of shields all suffer from 2 primary weaknesses. 1. The shield was an active defense and could be bypassed if not activated. And 2. Both physical and beam melee weapons completely bypass them entirely. Not too different from UC's eye fields. And fun fact again, most people consider 00 to be the first Gundam worked with melee-based remote weapons, but that's actually not correct. The Legend had them prior. And these Dragoons could easily bypass positron reflector shields, if my classification of beam blades was a bit vague. Continuing with the light wave barrier offshoots, we have the CE beam shields, which were equipped on the Strike Freedom, Destiny, Legends, Infinite Justice, Stargazer, and Rising Freedom. And later onto the Black Knight Kaurea and Shiva, which we'll be saving for a separate section. All being the Turian engine-powered Gundams, barring Stargazer and Rising Freedom. The uptime of these beam shields was extremely impressive and virtually limitless. Just like their UC counterparts, they were capable of blocking beams and ballistics alike. Despite being developed from the light wave barrier, the CE beam shields were capable of defending against beam blades, unlike the positron reflectors. I didn't mention it during the F91 era beam shields, but in Victory, beam shield sizes were adjustable, and that's present in the CE ones as well. As we see, the shields can expand to be large enough to cover an entire mobile suit. Another parallel that I shared with its UC counterpart is, remember when I said beam blades don't clash in CE? Well, that doesn't apply to beam shields, so that's something. Pros and cons mirror those of the UC shields, except the CE ones have never really been penetrated before, unless you count this scene where Strike Freedom gets overwhelmed. While on the topic of UC and CE parallels and beam shields, the Dom Trooper is equipped with a pair. However, that's not what I want to discuss here. Unlike the UC counterpart's completely featless jet stream attack, yes, I said what I said. Just because it's a classic doesn't make it good. The Dom Trooper is equipped with a defensive system called the Screaming Nimbus, which disperses high-energy Mirage Colloid particles around itself. In episode 41, it is used by the CE version of the Black Tri-Stars to block a beam shot for literally 2 frames. So instead, I'm gonna play the clip from episode 48, where they use it to close distance against a Force Impulse. Much like other beam shields discussed in the video, the Screaming Nimbus is an active defense, which makes it counterable when deactivated. However, the fact that it can be used offensively gives it an edge over the standard CE beam shield, since this is the only functionality from UC, specifically F91, that didn't carry over to the timeline. Okay, before we get to the one you're all waiting for, we're gonna go a little out of order, just to make the video flow a bit better, so bear with me. We have the Stargazer Gundam, which has a kind of blink and you miss it beam defense feat against the Strike Noir's beam pistols. The Stargazer's claim to fame is obviously its design. However, not being actually designed for combat, the Voltaire Lumiere system was able to produce a side effect of beam cutters, which are represented by translucent green effect pieces in Gunpla form. These beam rings were able to act both defensively and offensively. However, a major weakness of the Gundam was that it wasn't nuke powered, resulting in the VO system lasting for only 1 minute before getting drained. Finally, the unequivocal king of beam defenses across the entire Gundam franchise. We have the Gundam Akatsuki's Yato no Kagami, a golden mobile suit with a form of beam defense. Hey, that's just like the Shiki. Talking about at the end of the Seed Destiny portion will be perfect, since I get to seamlessly transition the video into Seed Freedom defenses. The Yato no Kagami was a beam defense system that came in a mirror surface armor composed of nanoscale beam diffraction lattice layers and ultra-fine critical plasma suppression layers. Coupled with the Gundam sensors, allowed this disco ball of death the unique ability of reflecting beams at will. Chances are, if you know anything about the Akatsuki, you know its beam defense is absolutely busted. It has its weaknesses, but we'll get there in a little. Back to what makes it so insane. It's a passive defense. You know how earlier I've been mentioning how so many defenses' weaknesses are that they're active defenses only? Yeah, no, the YNK doesn't suffer from that. Meaning if you were to shoot a beam rifle at the Akatsuki 25/8, 366 days a year, you'd never ever damage it. Assuming you'd survive, because it has the added benefit of reflecting beams back at you. Unlike the Geschmatic Panzer, which generally reflected shots away from itself. As an added bonus, the Akatsuki had its own version of a fin funnel barrier, created by its Dragoons, which not only embarrassed New Gundam's version by blocking battleship class beam cannons, but also missiles too. Before we talk about its upper limit of strength, let's discuss what can counter it. Beam blades have been shown to easily bypass YNK as a hard counter. The Akatsuki also doesn't possess PSA, which makes it a bit more vulnerable to physical ammunition, but no more than standard non-PSA CE era suit. Even if you're assuming the YNK is only applied to the golden areas of the MS, then the beam boomerang cutting through the arm frame / joint is a no-brainer. But in reality, earlier in the same episode, Destiny's anti-ship sword actually cut through the shield as well, which if you've seen Seed Freedom, you'll know that's also lined with YNK. Yes, even on the black parts of the armor. Also not really a beam feat, but the Akatsuki was able to fly through a light wave barrier with ease, when comparing to how the Infinite Justice flew through it. I had nowhere to include this, so it's just here. Okay, finally onto the true strength of the YNK. In Sea Destiny, we only ever saw it really tanking beam rifles and multi-phase shots. However, in episode 49, we get to see it completely no-sell the Minerva's positron blaster cannon. No shield, no anything, just a dead-on shot to the unit's body. Absolutely no damage. The only thing is, the shot was diffracted rather than reflected in this case, which is, you know, no biggie, cause it still tanked antimatter. If that wasn't insane enough, 1 year later in CE, the Akatsuki made its triumphant return, this time onto the silver screen, where it blocked and reflected a colony laser equivalent all on its own. I know, I complained that the unicorn's feat was silly, but this is crazy as hell, but and a little different, cause I kinda buy that the Akatsuki could pull it off via precedence. This is the first and only time we get to see the Akatsuki's upper limit, since we see parts of its armor superheated after the shot, implying that if Mu went under any longer, the YNK might have started to fail. And for that, until usurped by future work, the Akatsuki is the undisputed king of beam defense in the whole Gundam franchise. Hey, don't click off, there's still like 20 years of Gundam Works to cover. Now that we're in the Seed Freedom, get ready for some Looney Tunes levels of absurdly strong defense. Starting us off, we have the flagship of Compass, the Millennium, which was a successor to my beloved. It was equipped with a brand new style of beam defense in the form of crystalline armor, which was formed by a gel that hardens to create an ablative heat and shock protective crystal shield. Earlier I said get ready for absurdity, I wasn't kidding. In the movie, the Millennium's crystalline armor took fire from a whole fleet of ships, including the Gulvig's 12 positron blaster cannons, all while taking absolutely no damage from all that. The Millennium also had anti-beam depth charges, but we covered that already, so on to the next entry. Oh, and a minor con with this armor, it could only be used once per sortie, but hey, that keeps the balance in a storytelling sense. Developed from phase shift in an era that was heavily becoming more beam dependent, the Kingdom of Foundation developed the Femto technology armor, which served the exact opposite purpose of PSA, in which it nullified and absorbed low to mid-tier beams, all while recharging the holder's battery. In the movie, we only got to see it tanking beam rifles and multi-phase shots, which is a shame, since I'd like to know the upper limits, but for pros, FT armor is largely a passive defense, which eliminates most of its downtime, and also has the added benefit of recharging the mobile suit, which we'll see the inspiration for later. But most importantly, it was introduced during a time in CE where a paradigm shift occurred, since phase shift started to, for lack of a better word, phase out ballistic weapons to an extent. Just look at the Legend and Infinite Justice. Their only source of physical output were to see was Vulcans, which is a perfect segue into another massive strength of FT armor. Up until this point, I neglected calling it a beam defense. Make no mistake, it is one, but it was also capable of blocking lower tier physical ammunition as well, including the likes of Sea Whiz and missiles, making it a very well-rounded form of defense in general. That being said, it's not without its weaknesses. Granted, the last counter I'm going to list would counter literally any form of defense and armor grading in the whole franchise, but that being said, a strong enough physical attack can bypass FT armor. Think railguns, and this also includes physical melee weapons too, like a standard physical sword/blade, or even the physical tip of an anti-ship sword that has beam on the side, though it appears heat rods do not have sufficient power to damage it. Speaking of melee weapons, like the Akatsuki's YNK, FT armor does not protect against beam-bladed weapons either. It's also assumed that point-blank attacks would be enough to breach the armor, shown by the Destiny Spec 2's long-range beam cannon and the Palma Fiocchina, which were only shot at point-blank when dealing damage to Black Knights. This is reinforced by the fact that Ashiva was seen blocking Strike Freedom Type 2's abdomen cannon with the FT armor VFX. And this is super convenient for me, since we know that Strike Freedom's and Destiny's cannons are of exact strength via Seed Destiny episode 41. Scaling that to Type 2 and Spec 2 respectively, that would mean that the Rudra would have no problem blocking Destiny's beam cannon if it wasn't shot at point blank. That and there's a lack of FT armor VFX in this shot, further reinforcing the point blank theory. Though a couple variables could be that the Shiva could have a stronger FT armor than the Rudra's, being a commander suit and all, and the incomparable output of the Palma Fiocchina, which was shot at point blank in every instance used except a single curious time in episode 41. Okay, finally the last counter to FT armor, and really any armor, is the Mighty Strike Freedom's Disruptor. How it's worded here, pulled directly from the HG manual. The Disruptor would just GG easy any armor in Gundam. Full stop. As it fundamentally disintegrates on an atomic level. And FT armor was no exception to this rule, as we actually get to see the weapon used tactically as opposed to strategically when Kira blasts a Kareya with only a few seconds of charge time in the middle of a melee, completely atomizing its left arm. Speaking of the Mighty Strike Freedom, let's backtrack a little. In the movie, we get to see what appears to be either an unused ability from Seed Destiny or an upgrade for Seed Freedom, depending on which camp you land in. With Strike Freedom Type 2's Dragoon Barrier, that briefly appears during Kira's battle with the Kalrea and Shiva. Though later in the bout, the Strike Freedom converted into the Mighty Strike Freedom thanks to the Proud Defender, which enabled its usage of nanoparticles, which created a barrier capable of withstanding an equivalent of a small fleet's barrage from the Kalrea and his Ziggurats, which included multiple multi-phase shots as well. Additionally, it was also shown to be used at mid and close range. And in an extremely blink and you'll miss it moment, the Mighty Strike Freedom actually demonstrated that the barrier could block the Kalrea's abdomen cannon at near point blank range as well, which absolutely dunks in eye fields at this point. Though I think it's worth noting that there's a chance that the nanoparticle barrier is a beam only defense, because after the Ziggurats fired missiles, Lacus activated the Mighty Strike Freedom's discharge AoE attack, which not only destroyed every missile fired, but also disabled the Kalrea's Dragoons. We're not exactly sure if this was done to imply that the nanoparticle barrier couldn't block missiles, but even if that was the case, the Mighty Strike Freedom still had phase shift armor, making its defensive capabilities extremely powerful and well-rounded, which is pretty fitting for the endgame suit from CE, which closes out our little mini section on Cosmic Era as a whole. Making our way into Anno Domini, we have a very humble beam defense that wasn't actually designed for it, yet still managed to achieve it with the defense rod. Also equipped onto the Union flag, Rialdo and Hellion and their variant models, the defense rod worked in a similar way to the beam rotor from Victory, except with the physical blade, and it generated a plasma field for protection. Granted, in the flag clip you're seeing, the defense rod is pretty banged up after taking fire from the Dynamis' GN beam pistols, which skew really low in terms of GN beam output, only beating out Exia's GN Vulcans. But on the other hand, in an absolutely blink and you'll miss it, single digit amount of frames, the Inac Customs defense rod seems to go unscathed after taking 3 shots from Exia's tiny beam rifle, which should have the same relative output with the Dynamis' beam pistol, leading me to assume that the Inac has a more durable defense rod. Of course, distance/beam attenuation factors aside. It was also worth noting that the overflags were equipped with AD's anti-beam coating. However, there's no real footage of the ABC with notable effects or feats, so I'll save that for a golden crab later on. If anything, the ABC was shown failing to save Joshua, who got one-shotted by the same beam pistol that shot Graham's defense rod. So needless to say, the flag's ABC was useless in the grand scheme of things. Anyway, the strengths and weaknesses of defense rods are pretty self-evident, so we'll move on to GN technology next. Early on, the GN field wasn't used to counter beams, since, you know, the whole last world didn't have beams to shoot at it yet, but in episode 21, a Jinx was actually able to damage the Virtue by matching the compression rate of its field. This is the first time in the series where a GN field was breached. Up until then, it tanked nearly everything. Granted, it was all from low tier ballistic fire, but still a very robust field without a doubt. One of its major strengths, like FT armor, and honestly surpassing it in this regard, the GN field was extremely effective against both beams and projectiles alike, with a much higher damage ceiling for both. It's worth noting that despite the majority of GN fields on screen being spherical, 00 Gundam in episode 26 and the 00 Quanta in the movie were actually able to generate completely unique planar barriers. Additionally, for real drive Gundams, the operational time limit of the fields are greatly extended and virtually limitless, depending on particle generation speed versus usage speed. However, like any conventional defense, there are weaknesses to keep it balanced in the scope of storytelling. And in the GN field's case, there are kind of a lot. Starting with the obvious one first, Exia's GN sword was designed with the express purpose of being a plot device in the season. I meant for the express purpose of bypassing GN fields, and by extension, later GN sword successors and GN blades possessed the ability as well. Another counter came in the form of GN fangs. They kind of just fly right through GN fields. There's no explanation as to why, they just kinda do. Another unexplained one, Agner whips, the AD equivalent to heat rods, also bypass GN fields. Just cuz. That's it. Yet another unexplained counter to GN fields was the Seraphim Gundam's manipulators, which kinda also just goes through them. Why? Don't know. The show didn't care to tell us. And as mentioned before, if particle compression rates are matched, then beams can bypass them too. And additionally, and if a beam has sufficient strength to overwhelm the field, it can work too. For example, the Riser Sword. Despite having a lot of weaknesses, make no mistake, the GN fields in 00 were absolute beasts in story, and rarely broke or got breached. It just sounds way worse when I'm listening to them all in succession, rather than throughout the course of 50 episodes. And if I stay here trying to list every GN field unit in 00 along with every instance where it blocked we'd be here for 7 hours. Oh, and one real quick aside, I lied. Again. I know I should on openings being non-canon, but this one has a really cool detail. In opening 2 of 00, the best opening of 00, we see a very brief Gian field appear when Exia draws both of its beam sabers out at the same time, presumably clashing them before separating. And if you know how UC beam sabers work at all, this is a neat little reference to how I-field tech is used for those. And really quick, while on the topic of Gian beam sabers, in episode 37, the head Sakigake blocked Double Gundam's beam shot, which is worth mentioning when going from AU timeline to timeline. Speaking of that golden crab from earlier, the Alvatore had both a Gian field and ABC. Hey, that's just like the Shiki. Which, unlike the overflags, we actually have footage for. Yay! Oh, it got damaged in its only scene? Well, that's... okay. Hey, but at least there's a Gian field that's really strong and powered by 7 Gian drives, right? Oh. Hey, at least there's a backup mobile suit docked within the mobile armor, like the Dendrobium, but equipped with its own Gian drive capable of generating a Gian field. Oh. Okay. The express purpose of being a plot device. Another UC staple makes its appearance in AU, this time it's the anti-beam missile. Except in 80's case, they're GN field hand grenades. Equipped on the Jinx 3, as the name implies, it was a hand grenade that was thrown and when detonated, would disperse it create a temporary GN field. I'm gonna also add another missile style defense into the mix with the Tallmiles 2's missile launchers, which can be outfitted with GN beam dispersal missiles, which act and behave exactly like the UC counterparts. Think the General Revel from Unicorn without disrupting GN beam sabers. Additionally, a similar technology was used for the Outlaws' Baikal class. In episode 47, after Setsuna Riser's swords, 3 of them, they explode, dispersing a large anti-particle field that was potent enough to render the GN Sword 3's rifle mode useless, which was no slouch of a weapon. Unsurprisingly, the strengths and weaknesses are identical to their UC counterparts as well. Albeit not designed purely for beam protection, the Chardum Gundam and later Gundam Zabanya's shield and holster bits respectively were capable of such protection. Not to mention, the very first time Chardum's shield bits were deployed was meant for beam shots in episode 38, which is a lot later than when I remembered for its first time usage when I was rewatching 00. Cause that means Chardum went 13 episodes with its bits mounted, and they just sat there, waiting. A strength of the Jin shield bits were that they were remote weapon style shields, meaning that they could be repositioned freely to also protect allies, and since they used Jin particles, they worked under gravity as well. Additionally, they could combine to create larger shields for greater protection coverage. In hindsight, I should have rearranged the order of these factors to use the clips side by side, but it's too late now, and I'm currently at an unspecified late hour in the night, and I'm losing my mind, and I'm losing my voice, and I'm losing my pain. And finally, the shield bits being equipped on a Trans Am compatible suit means all of its stats can be tripled, including defense. And if this wasn't enough, they could also assume a more offensive configuration to shoot as well. Their weakness is honestly pretty simple. They're just flying physical shields really, so sufficient output would destroy them, which we do see a few times throughout the show. Zabanya's holster bits behave exactly the same defensively, so it'd be redundant to go much into detail on them. Also, I didn't know where to put this, but the Arios Gundam has Gen beam shields, which is one of a kind in 00, and never used defensively, only offensively. So I thought it was worth noting, purely because of this image. Elses, or extraterrestrial living metal shapeshifters, is an alien race that appears in Awakening of the Trailblazer movie, and don't actually possess dedicated beam defenses, but were shown to be able to adapt during combat to deflect both the Celestial Being's GN laser, which is comparable to a colony laser, and the Double Quanta's Riser sword. Yup. Not Quantum Sword. Yes, that's the official name given to it based on games. That aside, this feat also means the Elses were capable of adapting to beam blades as well. Granted, only the moon-sized Elses was able to do this, but this ability to self-evolve could only be done with the help of Kia. Oh wait, wrong word. Right ability though. Overall, not much is known about this form of defense, but that's the whole point of the Elses really. They're a pretty esoteric race in the franchise, and it adds to their mystery. And with that, we conclude the section on AD. From this point onward, the AUs won't be nearly as comprehensive as UC, CE, or AD, since they're relatively shorter works, so let's just blast through some of them, shall we? Okay, I'm gonna level with you. Unlike many, and I mean many of the prior works, I've only watched Gundam Age once, so I may have forgotten a beam defense here and there, but I'm semi-confident I got everything. With that being said, let's start with the main one featured on a bunch of Vegan suits. Electromagnetic armor is the only defense in Gundam that explicitly blocks beam sabers. I know I said Heavy Arms Gundam did it many minutes ago, but electromagnetic armor is not only designed for it, but also consistently blocks it along with deflecting beam shots via energy barriers. This armor type is extremely potent for the same reasons as FT armor in CE, because in the advanced generation, many, and I mean an overwhelming majority of suits and MAs were equipped exclusively with beam weapons. The major weakness of electromagnetic armor is it wasn't designed to counter physical damage, which granted, wasn't prominent in AG to begin with, and also could be overpowered by sufficient output. And for mass-produced vegan suits, the electromagnetic armor could only be applied to forearms, leaving the rest of the suit vulnerable to beam damage. The most unique MC mothership in Gundam was equipped with 3 and 4 tube missile launchers that could be outfitted with anti-beam dispersal shells. Ah yes, another UC staple returns, except in this case the wiki actually directly compares it to the depth charges in CE, and says it has a greater range than them. That being said, the Diva's anti-beam dispersal shells VFX actually mirrored that of the Big Rangs more than the traditional smokescreen of this defense type, and were used not only to protect ships equipped with them, but also allied forces, namely mobile suits. Later in episode 26, we get to see the Amadeus and Dios class ships utilize the same shells the Diva did, which actually demonstrates the same weakness that the public class's missiles had, which was over time beam attenuation would wear off cause something space dispersion blah blah blah. The Vegan Mobile Fortress Downs was equipped with an extremely powerful beam defense called the Gigantus Shield, which was able to completely disperse the Diva's Photon Ring Ray Enhanced Photon Blaster, which according to build fighters is pretty comparable to the likes of a Colony Laser or the CB's GN Laser. This shield was able to completely negate what would have been fatal damage for Downs. The major weakness of the Gigantus Shield, and planar barriers in general, are that they only protect from frontal attacks, and in episode 27, the Diva shot its Photon Blaster at the Fabos, causing it to crash into Downs from behind the shield, which ultimately dropped it. Look, another gold-esque MS with ABC, just like the Shiki. Yup, you heard that right. AG also has ABC, and along with it, the Gordolin also possessed a beam scraper. While not being a beam defense per se, was able to block beam shots. The main weakness of the Gordolin was the ABC was similar to that of UC's, in the sense that, say it with me now, with sufficient output, it can be overwhelmed or breached. Other than ABC, the drill was already something active defense. At this point, I'm gonna stop saying whether defenses were active or not. It's pretty self-evident and getting pretty repetitive, so just assume it is if I don't explicitly mention it as a weakness. Not a staple, but similar to the Raider Gundam's hammer, the H2 Darkhound's anchor shot could be spun at high speeds to be used as a makeshift shield, since the Darkhound doesn't retain the physical shield from the H2 normal. Not much information is given on this, since it's a makeshift defense, however it's plausible to assume that the wire of the anchor shot is anti-beam coated, since we know that tech exists in AG already with the previous entry. Alright, time for the two heavy hitters of AG, starting with the Legolas. Its bits are already a bit ridiculous, given their remote controlled beams. However, that aside, they're able to create a particle barrier like the GN field, which granted the Legolas beam protection. Similarly, the HFX's C funnels function a similar way to the Legolas, and granted the Gundam a spherical barrier for beam protection. Notice how I specified spherical. And now notice how the C funnels are straight and not curved. I'll leave it at that, you can piece it together. However, unlike the Legolas, the FX's C funnels can be used similarly to the shield bits of AD to protect friendlies, and in Kyo's case, foes as well. We finally reached it. The single most controversial beam defense in the whole franchise. There's generally three camps when it comes to the fan perspective of nanolaminate armor. A. You believe that NLA can negate all beam damage. B. You believe that Tomino said that GM can destroy Barbados. C. You rightfully think that both A and B are... I'm gonna go over the canonical feats of NLA and discuss its limitations and strengths. And no, I will not count Build Diver's backlog for this specific discussion, since the build series aren't proper timelines. So this will only go over the content from the 2 seasons of Iron-Blooded Orphans. I won't be including Gecko or Urd Hunt, since something animated shows / movies only. Okay, before we start, I should highlight my bias and reassure you that I'll be setting it aside for this portion of the video. I'm a huge Bio fan, probably on the same level of McGillis at this point. I have bought and built the high grade 6 times, including the metallic gloss injection version that comes with the Blu-ray of Season 2 and the exclusive clear coating one, along with getting the first run of the full mechanics in the P-Bandai Metal Robot Damashi. Needless to say, I love the Bio, and by extension IBO at large. I recognize its flaws, and trust me, there are a lot of them. but I can still call it my favorite Gundam series because I watched it during some pretty turbulent years of my life. Note that I said favorite, not best. You can have a favorite that's not objectively the best thing out there. Guilty pleasures and tastes exist. Like, the best series is obviously War in the Pocket. But that's not my favorite work. I recognize IBO's writing takes a nosedive in season 2, but I still enjoy the show regardless. Enough rambling, let's rip the band-aid off. NLA is somehow both overrated and underrated at the same time. I'm gonna read the wiki blurb verbatim, as it's imperative that we're all on the same page for this one. Nanolaminate armor. A special metal paint that reacts to AHAP particles. It is vapor deposited onto the surface of the armor of mobile suits and ships. This defensive paint forms a multi-layer molecular arrangement capable of handling impact from the outside, but it can break or peel off, requiring repainting. At first glance, the armor seems hard, but in principle, it's like a very thin cushion with several layers. It was one of the technologies developed as a countermeasure against mobile armors, and is capable of rendering mobile armor's beam weaponry ineffective by diffusing and deflecting the fired beam, minimizing the damage done even to the extent of nullifying it. However, nanolaminate armor does not absorb the beam's energy or weaken it. Nanolaminate armor is also effective against physical projectiles, as its energy-bearing molecules can absorb the impact from live ammunition and explosive charges, thereby protecting the machine's body from damage. As a result, ranged firearms are unable to score decisive hits against them. I did skip a few segments in there, but they weren't really relevant to anti-beam defense, so let's just get into it. Let's start with the weaknesses first, since it's going to take a lot less time. The one known explicit weakness of NLA is heat. In episode 7, Biscuit notes that the incendiary missiles could burn off the nanolaminate of the Isaribi. And in season 2, episode 11, Chad notes that the temperature in his cockpit was rising when tanking the Hashimo's beam cannon. Meaning a very easy way to counter NLA would be: granted, the Airmaster clip would kill nearly any pilot given enough time, but flamethrowers weren't present in PD, at least based off of what we've seen in IBO. But that's the boring stuff. You came here for beam defense. Contrary to some delusional beliefs, NLA cannot tank every form of beam fire. If you think for a second an NLA equipped mobile suit or ship is tanking a shot that can fully envelop a colony, which is multiple miles and kilometers in size, you're out of your damn mind. Because this isn't even about the armor's durability. NLA is only applied to the external armor of PDMS. The exposed frames are not coated with it, since NLA is essentially a giga paint, though there are 2 Gundam frames that suspiciously change colors. But I'm gonna ignore that forever. If it wasn't obvious enough yet, NLA has limitations when it comes to beam output as well, since in essence it's a very fancy version of ABC technically. If the beam output is strong enough to bypass the armor, it will fail, since we know it's prone to peeling and burning off in combat. Granted, we don't see this in a show, since the only thing we have to go off of is the Hashimo. However, it's not illogical to infer that a beam shot with enough volume to hit the exposed frame/joints would cause damage to PD mobile suits. Alright, before I get absolutely eviscerated by IBO fans, let's move on to the strengths of NLA. For one, many people oftentimes forget that it's not only a beam defense, and actually pretty effective against mid to low tier ballistic fire as well, kinda like the FT armor or GN fields. Here's a cool observation with the spark color in IBO. If you rewatch the show and see the blue and orange sparks, it visualizes NLA taking damage, as opposed to orange only sparks that occasionally occur in non-NLA equipped units like mobile workers. Okay, onto its beam defensive feats in the series, that being the Hashimo's beam cannon. Okay, let's get something straight. The Hashimo's beam cannon is powerful, and I'm not basing this off of the fact that it destroyed Kreese, but instead this scene. The ability to cut through solid bedrock is absolutely insane. You know what else could do something like that in Gundam? I don't think I need to explain how crazy this feat is. You can directly scale this with the Shiden, Landman Roddy, and Barbaros Lupus, as they got shot with the exact same beam cannon, and 2 of them came out unscathed. Granted, Rai's machine gun exploded, so that's why his hand got damaged, but either way, largely undamaged regardless. So with knowledge of the Hashimo's beam cannon cutting through miles of bedrock and the blocking feats in mind, it's pretty obvious that NLA's upper limit of beam blocking is really high, and this should explain why I called it a really fancy ABC earlier. Since we never actually get to see NLA getting bypassed, the upper limit of beam protection is technically unknown, but once again, saying it can block off something absurd like Libra's cannon, which can wipe an island, is pure delusion. Because only one unit is able to do something similar, unassisted. Yeah, no, you don't count. One thing to note about the Hashimo's beam cannon is that there is a chance that it has variable output, which may affect your conclusion on whether the NLA was blocking shots on the same caliber as the Mars rock cutting one, but not enough info is known about the Hashimo to draw that conclusion. So the only logical way to approach this is at face value. Okay, on to debate on whether NLA can block beam sabers. The boring answer is, we don't know. And technically the same can be said about beam shots from any other timeline too, really, since we wouldn't know how tech differences would behave in a cross-universe scenario. However, using an educated guess, I'd personally say that it would take a few hits from beam blades before getting melted through, since beam blades generally burn at really high temperatures. But not saying beam shots are extremely hot too, obviously we see that in the show, but a standard beam rifle shot is a quick transient burst rather than a sustained Groby for all my EXVS homies out there. So TLDR and soft recap, since the section is nearly as long as the one on Gundanium, NLA is an extremely powerful form of beam defense. However, it does have the same limitations as if it was a super ramped up form of ABC. While the on-screen beam feats are brief, an educated analysis of the armor would be that it could block low, mid, and even higher tier beams, but not something that would cause environmental damage to them. And when it comes to versus scenarios regarding timelines, if you take them too seriously, you're equally as lmao. We're finally getting to a very recent work in the franchise with The Witch from Mercury. And we have a kind of vague entry onto the list with the Elfrus Compo Gun Bit Shield and the Aerial/Rebuilds Escutcheon. All three shields behave the same, so I'll be making sweeping statements that apply to all of them. The reason why I call these shields vague is because they're not described to have ABC, nor do they behave exactly like an eye field. Rather, there's something in between. From the clips on screen, when the shield blocks beam shots, they exhibit a very similar VFX to that of an eye field, that the wiki notes as having anti-beam field properties, in the sense that a spherical-esque invisible barrier appears in front of the shield, which deflects incoming shots. However, it's implied that the shields don't provide 360 degrees of protection, as we see every instance used, Soletta having to either actively raise her left arm to block, or for the gunbutts having to position themselves directly in the line of fire of shots. Had that been a 360 degree barrier like an eye field, then the Gundams would never need to raise their arms at all, and also would never need to array the bits defensively. Additionally, the individual bits can be separated for the aerial and rebuild specifically. In their bit on form configurations, there seems to be a specific bit that serves as a small shield for the left arms, and we even see these individual bit segments counter the Darabald's Gusai's Veras, which essentially are beam saber funnels. And that's exactly why I can't call it an eye field equivalent despite what Unicorn says. But yeah, another pro would be that the gun bits are remote weapons. They have offensive capabilities as well. However, I want to highlight a brief feat that the Aerial had in episode 9, where Soletta created a fin funnel barrier S field after achieving permit score 6. Which at this point might as well join the ranks of ABC, I-Field, and Smoke as the new Gundam staple in beam defense. Alright, we're at the point in the video where the timeline gets because I'll talk about G-Reco first, then Turn A after, since no one can agree on the order of those two works. But technically the most recent official timeline put out by Gundam themselves says Rebuild Century is right after UC and before CC, and I have proof. I was there. So yeah, Bandai themselves put RC first and then Correct Century after, but all under the umbrella of the UC timeline, which I don't necessarily agree with, since by all accounts RC and CC are still AUs in my opinion, heavily on the latter, because it should go like this. The entire UC timeline into RC, into a third line with only CC on it, but also with the entire AU line into the third CC timeline as well, rather than CC being on the UC line, but that's just my 2 cents. Anyway, timeline show aside, let's get into the various defenses of the G-Self. Starting with its Tawasangan shield, it's capable of expanding to absorb beam shots. Though it was shown when not expanded, the shield was still impervious to beam damage, as the Jestima was able to cut through it with relative ease. While on the topic of shields, when the G-Self got upgraded to its perfect pack configuration, its photon armor shield, nicknamed the Copy Paste Shield, created a barrier of hexagonal structures to nullify and absorb beam attacks to recharge itself, which was an adopted feature from the Reflector pack. It was capable of blocking beam shots and blades alike. Speaking of the Reflector pack, it deployed an array of mirror-like structures behind the Gundam, capable of absorbing incoming beam shots and converting them into energy for the Gundam's battery. And I just want to note that this was VFX from 2014, and it's absolutely stunning. Onto the final notable pack of the G-Self that possessed beam defense. The Tricky pack is a very esoteric one, and that possessed I-Field (S) that absorbed beam shots and redirected them at enemy units in the form of projections, scrambling their electronic equipment. Moving forward into RC, we have the Jestima with its beam barrier. On the surface, it looks a lot like a beam shield, but if you look closely, there's 3 layers to it, kinda like the multi-layered Gigantus Shield of Downs. Though on screen, it did behave similarly to a beam shield, and it kinda reminds me of another shoulder-mounted barrier generator. The Jestima's barrier is gonna set a precedent for the remaining G-Reco entries, since the info on them are pretty brief, and their blurbs on their HE manuals are usually like 1 or 2 sentences. Either that, or if they full on lack a model kit to begin with. Alright, we haven't seen one of these in a while, but the next entry we have is an MA in the form of the Conque de Venus, which is said to have an eye field generator. However, this goes completely unused in the series, much like the Patulia. Instead, I'm adding it here onto the list for a different reason. Its beam sabers are shown nullifying a sustained beam rifle shot from the G itself. The reason why this is here, despite already mentioning beam sabers being able to block beam shots prior, is because it gives us insight into different timelines and how they handle their technology world building, specifically in the case of beam shot versus beam blade scenarios. Next, we have a mobile suit with a peak name, the Guy Trash and his beam cloak. The beam cloak was a very potent form of beam defense in the sense that it's not only capable of blocking a variety of beam shots from multiple directions, but also could be used offensively to bind and shock enemy MS. The beam cloaks, well, cloak-like structure allowed it to bend and morph into shapes that were often atypical compared to traditional beam shields. Continuing the trend of malleable beams, we have another mobile armor with the Yudriso and its reflector barrier. On the surface, one would expect a timeline that explicitly follows UC to feature another MA with an eye field. However, the barrier the Yudriso possesses looks a lot closer to a non-eye field, like the Ahava Azeru. However, instead of hexagonal projections, the reflector barrier erects what I can only describe as a giant kaleidoscopic pattern that completely covers the front of the MA. The next Venus Globe MS here is the Dahak with its beam barrier. Being from the same manufacturer as the Justima, the Dahak naturally features similar technology. However, what sets it aside from this brethren is the Dahak features an ability called Plunder, where it utilizes an eye field to absorb the enemy unit's energy from their beam weapons. And in the Clip's case, it stole power from the Justima's beam saber. Though, on the surface, the beam barrier looks a lot like a standard beam shield that you'd find in late UC, since it could counteract both beam shots and missiles. For the last RC entry, we have the G-Ract in this barrier shield. Like any other good MA, it comes with an eye field like barrier, except this time it's not invisible. Instead, the G-Rack starts by creating multiple rings around itself, much like the Stargazer, then creates a spherical barrier to block incoming shots. It was shown that once the barrier was dispersed, it was capable of disabling nearby enemies. Since G-Recko's tech specs are pretty underreported on, my educated guess is it does something similar to the Tricky Pack's eye field manipulation technology to scramble enemy mobile suits' electronic equipment. Aside from the barrier shield, the G-Rack was shown to have a robust enough armor to casually withstand beam rifle shots in what appears to be a very eye field-esque VFX. Coming into the very last entry for RC, we have the Unicorn Phoenix. Well, in case you weren't aware, G-Recko actually has a special episode that predates narrative by 3 years called From the Past to the Future, which takes place somewhere between episodes 16 and 17. And in it, we get to see what very closely resembles an eye field. And that's it. It's a Unicorn Gundam, out of its timeline, and has an eye field, as any Unicorn Gundam should. There's not much to add to that. I included to show you how thorough I want to be for this video. Alright, with RC done, let's get into the canonical last series of the whole franchise, despite coming out 25 years ago. And to wrap up the video, I'll be tackling all the beam defenses unique to the build series, and a quick montage of the pre-existing / repeat ones that cameo in them as well. With that being said, the Turn A Gundam itself is probably the most advanced form of eye field technology in the franchise, with its eye field beam drive, allowing it to give eye field properties to its armaments, like its shield and Gundam hammers. Unlike traditional eye fields, the Turn A is so advanced that it even allowed it a degree of protection against a nuclear blast wave, albeit being significantly further from the blast radius compared to this boy. I also want to note the absolute size of Turn A's eye field's coverage in episode 22, and this alone makes me believe that this is one of, if not the most powerful eye fields in Gundam, which isn't too far-fetched, given Turn A's reputation and how late in the timeline that correct century is set. Turn A's Oni-san, the Turn X possessed an eye field that is erected from its head, called the X-Top, and like the Turn A, it was able to protect against a nuclear blast wave as well. Additionally, the Turn X's Moonlight Butterfly wings shared a similar property to those of the Wings of Light, in that when localized, it blocked a couple shots from the Turn A's beam rifle. The Sumo shares the exact same IFBD as the Turn A, and can use its field repulsion processor units in its legs as a form of propulsion for mobility. Additionally, the Sumo's arm-mounted eye field generator was capable of eye field expansion, amplification, and projection, and could be used in a technique called eye field bunker, which is horribly fucked off by localization, so I'm gonna spare my brain for that one. And this clip right here comes from episode 22 as well, where we get to see Harry's Sumo's eye field getting overloaded by the same Wodon beam cannon that the Turn A blocked, which gives us a direct comparison between the two suits, concluding that the Turn A's eye field is on a whole other level. I should note, in episode 45, Harry personally notes that the sumo's eye field drains the pilot's life force as well. But there's a moderate to high chance that this is hyperbole, given Harry's hamness as a character. The sumo also could trap beams and missiles in his barrier as well. And in episode 49's case, a full-on mobile suit. A very overlooked suit from the correct century, the flat was equipped with a feature called hyper vibration, which allowed it to create a barrier while rapidly T-posing, capable of blocking incoming beam and ballistics alike. And it's possible that this was an inspiration for CE's phase shift armor, considering Turn 8 came out only 3 years before Seed. Much like the Moonrace mobile suits, the ships introduced in CEC had very advanced technology as well. Like the Gendarme had an eye field. But that's getting boring now. I want to talk about another ship in particular. The Almaya class absolutely peaks beam defense with its There's literally no explanation needed. This is fucking awesome. And with that, we've successfully wrapped up the main timeline portion of the video. Coming up, we have the build section and then the outro. For the build section, I'm going to omit ABC entries because honestly, the VFX for those are kind of underwhelming. And statistically speaking, if you're already this far in the video, you're going to watch to the end, so thank you for that. Starting off the build portion, we have a very surprisingly obscure entry to the average Gundam fan with the beginning 30 from Gunpla Builder's beginning G. Similar to the Turn A, but pushed to the max, this Gundam's whole gimmick was that it was all about eye fields. Except in its case, none of them were invisible. In the story, we actually get to see the eye fields being used in a variety of ways. Obviously, it was able to create a spherical barrier around the Gundam itself. It should be noted that the eye field doesn't necessarily behave like a standard one though, invisibility aside, since it was shown to protect the Gundam from rubble as well as beams of course. And since they were equipped on remote weapons, they were able to be deployed to shield friendly suits like when Haru protected his friends Bearguy and Sazabe. This additional equipment also strengthens his Gundam's offensive capabilities by increasing his beam rifle's output, and additionally the IFS unit could create a whip-like construct which behaved like a really high output beam saber. Onto its rival suit, the Forever Gundam was a souped-up ARC 78-2, specifically the HG G30th, and featured an homage to the new Gundam since its funnels were able to generate an eye field. Just like the new Gundam's barrier, it was breached in a similar fashion. However, the major difference was that since the Forever Gundam only featured 4 funnels, it was incapable of creating the same 5-sided pyramid structure that the new did, meaning it only acted as a frontal shield, rather than a barrier that could cover the entire suit. Remember this for later. That and what it blocked was kinda like a beam saber? Onto the main suit from Gundam Build Fighters, the Starbuild Strike introduced what I can consider to be a mini staple of beam defense, since you saw it previously referenced in the video multiple times, from works that would come out after Build Fighters. And that is the Absorb Shield, and as the name implies, it does just that after expanding. Kinda like with the added benefit of recharging the Gundam. In 2013, this was a brand new-ish and it was really cool. It still is, but lately a lot more beam absorption has been featured on suits, so the novelty is getting run through. But this was really the one that kicked it all off. The weaknesses of the Absorb Shield were that it couldn't defend against beam sabers and or can't handle extremely high output beams like a modded satellite cannon. When the Starbuild Strike gets upgraded to the Starbuild Strike Cosmos, it retains the same shield, however it gains the Absorb field, which does exactly what you think it does. And finally, when Sei upgraded to the Build Strike Galaxy Cosmos, he developed the Star System, combining both the Absorb and Discharge system, which was featured on the Cosmos shield, which was capable of diffusing beam shots. Based on its feats, it looks like its upper limit of protection far surpasses that of its predecessors, as it was able to take the brunt of the Amazon Gundam, I shit you not, prime cannons. And to compare to Starbound Strike, it wasn't able to defend against a satellite cannon if you remember, but the AZ Gundam's twin hyper mega launcher could one-shot Luna 2. And when in the prime cannon configuration, it has a further enhanced output, making the Cosmos shield a lot sturdier than the Absorb shield. The next build suit is a fan favorite asymmetrical design, the Wing Gundam Fenice, which featured a stylish beam mantle, likely inspired by this. It essentially functioned like a beam shield, except that it had cloth-like properties, like it could be wrapped around the Gundam's hand without damaging it. Other than that, it can block beam shots and beam blades, along with ballistics. While not getting much screen time, it was shown getting overwhelmed by Build Strike's beam saber, to give you an idea of its limits. Funnish fact time again, in case you didn't realize it somehow, the Wing Gundam Fenice's color scheme, barring the yellow, is actually supposed to represent the colors of the flag of Possibly the most badass form of beam protection comes in the form of offense, with the Sengoku Astrae's Kiku Ichimonji in Kotetsu, which were treated with particle alteration coating, making it possible for them to cut right through beam shots and blades alike. And the beam shots were no joke either. It was able to cut through both the Togi's 3's Mega Cannon, which is noted to be near the same tier as a twin bus rifle, and also cut through the Virtue's Burst Mode GN Bazooka along with its GN cannons. The swords are also shown to cut through GN fields as well. Speaking of swords, the Exia Dark Matter had the same technology, and was able to cut right through the Starboat Strike's high-powered discharge rifle shot like it was nothing, only using its beam saber. The EDM also has a modded GN sword called the Brinicle Blade, which super freezes matter it comes in contact with. And it was so ridiculously cold that it froze beam sabers. You know, the super hot plasma weapon staple in Gundam that burns at thousands of degrees? Yeah, it just freezes it. The Brinicle Blade isn't really a beam defense, but it sure as hell is a beam counter, and for that, it's on the list. Despite having no physical shield, the build burning, and in turn the tri burning, and in turn the Kamiki burning, and in turn the Shin burning Gundam all featured a ton of transparent parts inlaid between their armor. And these parts were used in a technique called pinpoint shield defense, which was able to deflect both beam shots and live ammunitions and missiles. Yeah, I said deflecting missiles. If you haven't watched Tri yet, it's as insane as it sounds. Additionally, when the build burning is upgraded into the tri burning, it somehow gains the ability to erect a planar barrier. There's like next to no information on what this barrier is at all, but it exists. And the Kamiki burning is capable of making the same barrier as well. I'm gonna lump this next one into the entry as well, since there's literally no info on these barriers, but the Bear Guy F could also make one too. Given that Mirai also trained in Domon's, the Jigen House School, it could be a technique developed from there, but nobody really knows, since Domon didn't do anything of the sort in all of G Gundam. It should be noted that the individual strengths of these fields are completely unknown, since they've always been layered with at least one other barrier when used. Backtracking a little, aside from the planar barrier, the tri-burning could also create a spherical one in episode 23 to block the Snebo Drago Gira's particle beam, which looks a lot closer to fire, lightning, and ice. And finally, hopping back to the OG build burning, in its debut battle, it tanked Lightning Gundam's beam rifle shots with this green Shipuzuki-esque wind effect around itself. And this was never done again, and likely was caused by the initial activation of the Gundam, considering it went orange briefly as opposed to the standard blue. This is notable since Sekai didn't unlock assimilation until episode 9, therefore making me draw the conclusion that it was a brief power jump for the Gundam, until it returned to its normal output. On to another member of Team Tri-Fighters. As you saw from the last clip, the Star Winning Gundam can also create a beam shield using its guard bits, which form a new Gundam-like beam barrier. Once again, being a remote weapon, they could be deployed to protect friendlies as well. Now that I've covered both the Star Winning and Build Burning variants, their barriers' defensive capabilities are really hard to gauge, as in Tri, they were able to sufficiently protect the Lightning Gundam from the Trion 3's ultimate attack. However, in Island Wars, the Northern Pod's Energy Phoenix bypassed it. However, in Island Wars, with the Kamiki Burning Gundam and help from the Bear Guy F, they were able to nearly block off the entirety of a colony laser, with only light damage. Meanwhile, in the previous example, both units were taken out of commission. Speaking of the Trion 3, is the biggest Giga Chat super robot barrier that prevented its transformation from being interrupted via the usage of excess particles. From the looks of it, it appears to be planar only, however not enough is known about it. Aside from that, it was shown to nullify something that nothing else in this list has explicitly been able to do, and that's fire. Alongside beams, of course. Though it's heavily implied phase shift can also withstand fire to an extent, but that's neither here nor there. The Gundam equivalent of this image, as for beam defenses, the Snebo Drago Gira, which I'll be calling SDR, cause the name is a little lmao, had a particle shield which was a triple planar barrier that kinda resembled magical circles in other anime, and was able to block low to mid tier beams, but absolutely got murked by the Tri-Burning's whole Howken, which, you know, is understandable, since the Moonbuster. Side note, I find it funny as hell that this would genuinely be the strongest attack in all of Gundam if it wasn't for the fact that this was a build series and that the build burning is a 5-inch tall plastic model. That's 12.7 centimeters for all you who despise freedom and burgers. Back to the SDR, it was shown that the particle shield could also be breached by beam blades as well. And finally, it seems that the particle shield served as a form of offensive amplification when the SDR shoots its black and red beam, which kinda reminds me of another build series dragon. Next, let's talk about the 3 Gundams from Team Celestial Sphere. All being GN-powered machines, you'd think they all have boring old GN field. No. The Portent does have a GN field that uses particle transformation, but what I wanted to talk about was far more unique. It has what's called a particle transformation field, which was used to localize small GN fields onto the unit's feet, allowing it to slide on incoming beam shots, cause why not, I guess. It can also erect a planar GN field as well. Being a direct sequel series to Build Fighters, the Gundam the End features what appears to be a variation of the Absorb Shields technology, except in its chest, where it can quite literally eat beams. Not much is known about this feature, like if it recharges the Gundam or not, but it's worth noting that the Gundam also has more forms of beam defense as well. In what appears to be ABC on the fist ends, yes, that's the real name, and his cloak was able to protect the Gundam from a shot from the crossbow and full-class Muramasa blaster. And finally, the Transient Gundam 2 had a standard GN field. However, it had one more absolutely bonkers, crazy, insano, pro max, ultra nightmare mode ability. There's very little information on this, but just from watching it, you can infer that the Transient's GN partisans may have some sort of coding similar to the Akatsuki's Y and K in order to not only deflect beams, but also make those beams deflect off each other in order to nullify 13 shots in one motion, despite the Cherubim only having 9 shield bits without the GNHWM configuration. But I'm gonna ignore that forever. And since the partisan can separate into lance bits, it's not too far-fetched to assume that the Transient can use them for allied defense as well, despite never using this ability ever in the show again. A modified Ultron Gundam, whose HG predates the OG by 6 whole years, has a pretty unexplained beam defense feat. I'm just gonna play it. I'm gonna be honest, I think either the furry pilot of the pseudo Super Saiyan Ultron Gundam blocked the beam banjo shot from a Cowboy Tequila Gundam through pure magic, or the fact that it was possibly something hypermode related. And there's a 100% chance that this was the first time this sentence was ever been uttered. A modified Cerevu from Minotaur Miles Backpack is a GN powered Gundam found in Build Divers. So you'd assume it has a GN field, right? Well, yes, you'd be right this time. However, it does possess one extra gimmick of being able to expand and force away nearby objects / enemies. It still does have the properties of a vanilla GN field, and was able to protect the Scheherazade from the GN Ultron's Shokan Ultimate Secret Rikugeki Shoryuda, which resulted in minor damage. And yes, technically that is classed as a beam attack. The Lotus Fortress that appears in Build Divers episode 15 is a modified Lavian Rose from UC, and featured 3 sizes of eye fields, small, medium, and large. It's mostly in this list due to the fact that this may be the single largest instance of an eye field in the whole franchise, despite being a build series. It's also worth noting that the VFX of it resemble more of a planar barrier as opposed to a traditional spherical shape, but at least it's invisible though. I'm gonna crash out. Oh, we're recording? By all means, this next one should fall under the repeat category. However, the SG Nu Gundam, which is a customized SD Nu Gundam with the double fin funnel type equipment, was capable of recreating the fin funnel barrier in SD form. However, that's where the similarities end. Because if you look closely, and I mean real closely, the SG Nu Gundam has 3 out of its 12 funnels deployed, and its rear is somehow covered by the barrier as well. If you recall, the standard Nu Gundam required 5 funnels to form its pyramid. I know the Roswell Jegan exists, and I'm not factoring it in for this, but even if you did, it can still make a pyramid with 4 funnels. But with the SG Nu, we're still missing one. To think about it, a 4-sided pyramid requires 4 corners, and in this case, they're funnels, and the Roswell Jegan has just that amount, and a 5-sided pyramid, which the Nu has, requires 5 corners / funnels. However, if you go down one from the Jegan, you get a 3-sided pyramid, which requires 3 corners. And if you thought to yourself, 3-sided pyramid? A 3-sided pyramid is just a triangle. You'd be correct. That's exactly what that is, and is exactly what the Strike Freedom Type 2 and Aero used, making the SG Nu Gundam absolutely break the laws of everything by having a barrier not only be a triangle, but also having that 2-dimensional triangle possess 3-dimensional properties as it protects from Vulcan gunfire from the front side, and at the same time as us seeing the effect come through from the back. Either that or it's all an animation error. Also, I'm gonna take this time to note that the Double Sky's Vulcans have been shown to shoot both physical and beam rounds. Either that or it's all an animation error. So that's ultimately why I decided to include the SG Nu Gundam onto this list, despite shortening my lifespan by about 42 years. Speaking of the Double Sky, it has 2 forms of beam defenses, one being uniquely exclusive to itself. The arm-mounted Sky Bracers and Sky Leg Guards essentially were extremely specialized beam shields, as they did everything standard beam shields could, but also can fully deflect shots back to senders. Mainly seen with the Leg Guards, capitalizing off of Riku's experience as a soccer player. Yes, I said soccer. Why did I say that? Soccer. On top of that, I know I said the Moonlight Butterfly wings of the Turn X had similar functionality to the V2's Wings of Light, but the Double Skies truly feels like a direct homage to it. Just see for yourself. This also gets improved upon when Riku upgrades to the Double Sky Mobius in episode 24 of Re-Rise. And also slightly related, Sarah, specifically Mobile Doll Sarah, can use a weakened version of the Moonlight Butterfly for both flight and large-scale beam protection. I'm gonna backtrack a lot more with the 00 Diver Ace's plot device wings from episode 12, which not only blocked beams but also erased viruses. Next up, we have the scaled down version of the giant mobile suit from Turn A, the Wodam Pod, and it featured a very vague form of defense aptly named Barrier. Based on its feats, it's relatively powerful, being able to block what appears to be a high output beam shot from a space dragon. Normally, given its association with Turn A, I would have drawn the conclusion that the Wodam Pod uses some sort of eye field technology, since sometimes they have a green color to them, but the fact that it's A, not invisible, and B, can defend against beam sabers leads me to believe it's its own thing. On to our very final proper entry onto this list. The Jupitive Gundam doesn't bring anything groundbreaking to the table, but what it does have breaks the mold by improving upon a classic. The multi-container bits featured in the Gundam's backpack are, as the name implies, bits. However, they're not just any bits. In the franchise, we've seen remote weapons serve a plethora of roles, including beam guns, beam blades, physical blades, scissors, shields, holsters, missiles, machine guns, etc. However, these are the only ones, so far, to feature beam shields on them. And for that, it was enough to be added on the list. Alright, I'm gonna play a montage of build repeats now. Enjoy. Oh, okay. I know I said I'd play these in a montage way, but I'll chime in when there's something notable. The original Opsaras 3/Opsalus 3, depending on localization, in the 8th MS team didn't feature any form of beam defense, or any defense for that matter. However, in episode 7 of Build Fighters, it was modded to have an eye field. And this is the only time in all of Gundam where an eye field is ever breached by a beam, and appropriately by a weapon as powerful as a satellite cannon. While I don't think build feats necessarily reflect proper timeline works, I still think they merit at least a ballpark assessment regarding how their proper timeline counterparts would behave. The Bound Dock never had any sort of beam defense, let alone any defense in all of Zeta, but when customized in Build Fighters, it was given diamond coating, despite being colored gold, hey like the Shiki! Which is really odd, and why am I talking about this right now instead of letting you enjoy the rest of the video without my annoying voice? See, it was able to absorb shots from the Fenice Liberta's beam rifle, however when Fellini shot his bust rifle, the Bound Dock deflected it instead. The diamond coating was only usable when the Bound Dock was in its MA mode, while its underside was vulnerable to both beam shots and blades. Or I guess wheels too in this case. Technically not a repeat since Crossbone's still never gone anime. It's just nice to see its base feature highlighted on screen. It's also nice to see an eye field capable of blocking beams at point blank as well. Okay, I lied many times throughout the video. Not about the subject matter of course, but rather regarding the formatting of the video. But I promise this really is the final one. I saved this one for the end because I find it very funny in a very unorthodox way. Enjoy this unexplained and unedited clip of the Camp for Amazing from Build Fighters. Okay, that's all of them. I don't have an outro. The video script's like 26,000 words long. And the video's already over 2 hours. Subscribe if you like the video, and I'll be making more. But these take months to produce, so turn on notifications, or don't. I genuinely don't know what engagement matters for growth anymore, because YouTube's a company run by literal lobotomites. If you really like the video, I have a channel membership, where you get early access to videos. And yeah, I'll see you in like July for another long video. Bye.